Can you imagine a civilization so strong and influential that it influenced a culture's myths and stories for thousands of years before vanishing nearly completely from history, leaving behind enormous ruins and confusing writing? We're referring to the Mycenaeans, the real Bronze Age giants of mainland Greece, whose influence can still be heard in the epic hero quests and Troy stories. They were only enigmatic characters mentioned in Homeric poetry for centuries, their magnificent citadels written down as the fantasy of poets. However, the physical evidence of their magnificence was revealed when picks and shovels collided with earth. Their castles' very stones stand as quiet reminders of a world gone. It's like discovering that your favorite fantasy book was a true story all along, isn't it? Even now, the enormity of their accomplishments, the complex web of their society, and the abrupt, spectacular way it all fell apart still chill me. Backbone of any historian. And maybe we can travel back in time to a period when these kings reigned, their chariots rumbling across dusty plains and their gold flashing in the Aegean sun. As the evening wears on and the outside world relaxes into silence, thank you for being here. I'm wishing you rest, tranquility, and perhaps some historical motivation before bed. Please take a moment to subscribe and like the video, but only if you truly like my work here. Would you mind sharing your location and time if you're listening tonight? Is it for you? The extent to which these tales spread is always amazing. Around the 3rd millennium BCE, the deep blue of the Mediterranean skies started to give way to the purples and oranges of dawn. Before the powerful walls of Tiryns or Mycenae even dared to aim for the sky, a gradual, nearly undetectable change was taking place on the Greek mainland. Smaller, dispersed farming communities with somewhat modest lifestyles lived on the land. They were definitely not the most advanced. We'll talk about people who live in palaces soon. However, despite their apparent modesty, these innovations were crucial early brushstrokes on the huge canvas of the Bronze Age. We're talking about humans learning how to work metal, initially with copper and later with bronze, which is a more stronger alloy. An arms race was triggered by a real game changer, and a boom in the economy that was uncommon in the ancient world. Shiny swords and ornate armor were not the only uses for this new material. It changed implements, making agriculture more mechanical, more ambitious in building, and more efficient. Imagine a silent revolution marked by the faint clang of hammers striking metal resonating over nascent towns. Often called the early Helladic peoples, these early occupants were establishing the fundamental groundwork for the later Mycenaean civilization's imposing accomplishments. Although they were the essential forerunners, they were not yet Mycenaeans in the sense of the highly structured, literate, aristocratic civilization that would develop. At first, their pottery was fairly simple, started to exhibit growing sophistication, a sign of evolving craft specialization. Their homes, which started off as rudimentary mud brick and timber constructions, eventually changed, suggesting a developing knowledge of design and social structure. It was implied that life wasn't always pastoral joy, and that resources that were once limited were now worth preserving by the development of defensive walls in some of these villages, such as Lerner in the Agalid. One might question whether, even in those days, someone was believing that if we simply raised these walls a bit and perhaps erected a large gate, we'd be unstoppable. These kinds of ideas might have been the earliest seeds of the enormous ambition that would define the Mycenaeans. The method by which these early, more scattered societies started to come together and diverge is especially interesting and continues to be a topic of intense scholarly discussion. Was it just the inevitable result of population growth and technological advancement?
Growth? Or did these changes stem from the rise of charismatic leaders, migrations, or outside forces? The archaeological record provides intriguing hints rather than definitive accounts, and there is no simple solution. For example, The emergence of new burial practices or pottery types may indicate the arrival of new groups, or it can just be a reflection of changing internal customs. It's similar to attempting to assemble a challenging problem when half of the pieces are missing and the rest are ambiguous. We do know, however, that a cultural change was evidently taking place by the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. With evidence of growing wealth inequality evident in their funerals, the small, rather egalitarian villages were gradually giving way to more hierarchical systems. All of a sudden, certain persons were being buried with grave items that were more remarkable, a clear indication that social ladders were being built and that certain people were moving up them more quickly than others. Additionally, there is no denying that the climate influenced these nascent civilizations. Agricultural methods and resource availability were determined by the Mediterranean climate, which features hot, dry summers and warm, rainy winters. Cereals like wheat and barley, as well as olives and grapes, were the mainstays of early farming and would subsequently form the basis of the Mycenaean diet and economy. The topography, which is a disjointed environment of rich plains and mountains, naturally encouraged the growth of unique regional settlements, each with its own unique personality, but all bound together by the slowly increasing web of trade and connection. Greece's geography, with its numerous islands and twisted coastlines, made shipping not just a choice, but frequently a necessity, promoting communication and the sharing of products and ideas long before great empires were established. It was actually a breeding ground for maritime skills that the Mycenaeans would later use in their adventures throughout the Aegean. Remember that the Mycenaean story doesn't start with a bang as we lull ourselves into the deep, but rather with the steady, silent hum of human adaptation, inventiveness, and the slow accumulation of knowledge. These fundamental actions by long-forgotten ancestors served as the cornerstone upon which Mycenaean civilization's entire majestic structure would eventually be built. As the sun rose higher over the Aegean in the early Bronze Age, it projected lengthy shadows across the nascent villages of mainland Greece, stone by stone. Across the waves, a unique and unquestionably strong cultural force started to have an impact: the Cretan Minoan civilization. Imagine, if you will, an island paradise full of colorful frescoes, ornate palaces, and a mastery of the oceans that enabled its inhabitants to travel far and wide, dispersing their sophisticated administrative methods, art, and architecture like seeds on the wind. By the Middle Bronze Age, around 2600 BCE, the Minoans had reached their pinnacle as a genuinely advanced maritime empire whose cultural influence stretched well beyond their borders while the mainland was still getting established. They had a significant impact on the developing Mycenaean world, a kind of elder, wealthier sibling teaching the younger mainlanders who are still growing up how to live. This Minoan influence is evident everywhere. Imagine the mainland chieftains, who were initially a little rough around the edges, coming into contact with the stunning refinement of Minoan items if you know where to look. All of a sudden, they were dealing for more than simply essentials. They were bringing in beautiful ceramics with flowing, dynamic patterns that were unheard of before. They obtained elaborate seal stones that were used to mark property and identify individuals, frequently featuring beautiful natural sceneries or fantastical animals. Most importantly, they started using Minoan frescoes, which turned dull mud brick walls into vivid displays of color and story that showed everything from serious religious processions to playful dolphins. When a mainland nobleman, accustomed to more austere settings, visits a Minoan palace, it's easy to see him thinking, "I need some of that in my lowly dwelling," and perhaps adding some of those beautiful bull-leaping acrobatics for entertainment.
In addition to being aesthetically pleasing, the Minoans offered a model for a more intricate social structure. A convincing model for the emerging mainland centers was provided by their opulent system, which concentrated governmental, religious, and commercial functions. The idea of a large central building serving as the center of an entire region probably originated from Minoan precedent. Consider it intellectual property transfer, but instead of software, it was palace blueprints and best practices for resource management. The Mycenaeans would eventually modify this model to fit their own more militaristic tendencies. In particular, Linear A, which, in contrast to its later cousin Linear B, fiercely holds on to its secrets and remains largely undeciphered, demonstrates the early adoption of Minoan writing systems on the mainland. This implies that the Mycenaeans were actively interacting with and making an effort to use Minoan administration instruments, rather than merely importing decorative objects. They seem to be saying something along the lines of, if it works for them, maybe it'll work for us. This was hardly a one-way path of pure goodness, but maybe with a few more spears and fewer dancing ladies. Practical concerns also played a role. Because of their sophisticated metallurgy and need for raw materials, the Minoans probably looked to the mainland for supplies of metals, wood, and other resources. They reciprocated by giving access to their vast Mediterranean trading networks, wine, olive oil, and luxury items. This mutually beneficial partnership promoted interdependence and eased the exchange of ideas. Demand and supply are meeting in a traditional way, with cultural absorption as a byproduct. Imagine a Minoan trader negotiating with a muscular mainland chief while looking magnificent in his robes. Even though their objectives and sense of style were very different, they each understood that they required what the other had. The Mycenaeans were not merely Minoan imitators, though. In spite of this significant influence, they developed distinctive qualities of their own that made them stand out. Even when influenced by Minoan forms, Mycenaean art tended to be more rigid, militaristic, and centered on themes of hunting, battle, and large processions, whereas Minoan art frequently stressed nature, fluidity, and religious ceremonies. Even though they served the same fundamental purpose, the palaces had different construction features. The throne room and focal point of Mycenaean palaces was the imposing megaron, a huge rectangular hall with 4 columns and a central hearth, a characteristic that was mostly missing from Minoan architecture. A fundamental difference in the underlying socio-economic structures and priorities is shown by this architectural discrepancy. Perhaps trade and ritual were more important to the Minoans, the Mycenaeans on military might and hierarchical power. Scholars are still debating whether this discrepancy indicates different cultural objectives from the start, or whether the Mycenaeans purposefully modified their knowledge to conform to a more martial social model. The uncertainty surrounding the final nature of their relationship is among the most fascinating elements of this Minoan-Mycenaean interaction. Was it always a time of amicable trade and cultural interchange, or did the mainlanders finally establish their power, possibly even capturing some Cretan territory? A more nuanced story is suggested by the archaeological record, especially around the period of the large Cretan destructions in the Late Bronze Age, around 1450 BCE. A Mycenaean takeover of Minoan administrative centers is strongly suggested by the abrupt introduction of Linear B script, an Achaean adaptation of Linear I, following these destructions. When the new management takes over and begins using their own internal memos, it's similar to a covert coup. The decline of autonomous Minoan power and the obvious rise of the mainland Mycenaeans as the dominant force in the Aegean is marked by this change, which represents a significant turning point. Think about how one civilization might emerge by studying, adapting, and eventually possibly surpassing another as we move apart.
With their advanced practices, the Minoans unwittingly fostered the very force that would ultimately overshadow them. Similar to an older sibling teaching a younger sibling how to ride a bike, only to be left behind at the next race. Now that the Minoan Crete cultural seeds were firmly established on the mainland, the conditions were favorable for the spectacular rise of discrete Mycenaean towns. Picture the untamed stream scenery, a mosaic of lush plains surrounded by the Aegean Sea and tucked away between towering mountain ranges. early communities, which were frequently constructed on top of pre-existing early Helladic sites, started to grow in these strategically advantageous areas, evolving from small villages into something far more important. The earliest indications of this change appeared in the late Middle Bronze Age at 1700–600 BCE, a change from unorganized homes to more structured and even fortified hubs. These were no haphazard groups of houses. They were well-selected locations, frequently high, that provided natural fortifications and sweeping vistas of important trade routes or farmland. Naturally, Mycenae, one of the most recognizable and potent of these new centers, is the source of the term Mycenaean. Its presence alone dominates the surrounding environment, as it stands majestically atop a hill in the Argolid Plateau. However, Mycenae wasn't by herself. Tiryns, with its enormous cyclopean walls that rise straight from the plain, is an example of a modern site. At the same time, Chios was ruling over Mycenae, which was productive. Each has a distinct regional taste, yet they all follow the same cultural path. Known as wanaks in later Linear B literature, they were the nascent city-states, or perhaps more appropriately, palace centers, each ruled by a strong individual. The carefully farmed area surrounding them would have formed a mosaic of grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves, serving as the agricultural foundation for these expanding populations. Building larger structures was not the only thing that went into the development of these towns. It had to do with the formation of a new social structure. The evidence of socioeconomic stratification is growing. More wealth and power are being amassed by some people and families than by others. The archaeological record clearly reflects this, especially in their burial customs, which we will discuss in more detail in the following section. However, differences are evident even in the settlement patterns themselves. A prominent centrally low building that is bigger and more ornate than the surrounding structures frequently appears, suggesting the rise of a ruling class. This elite would have been in charge of resource management, labor organization, and, most importantly, community defense. Even though it was somewhat primitive by today's standards, it's difficult to avoid picturing the first examples of what we would now refer to as urban planning. Drainage, entry points, and, above all, keeping intruders out were on someone's mind somewhere. Fortification was one of the characteristics that defined these communities apart, and would later become more noticeable. The latter Mycenaean phase is distinguished by its large, almost scary defensive construction, whereas the earlier stages may have comprised simpler defensive walls. These restrictions weren't only metaphorical, they were engineering marvels designed to withstand severe attacks. The grandeur of some of these early defensive structures, which foreshadowed the genuinely colossal walls of later Mycenaean citadels, is best described by the name Cyclopean masonry, which refers to stones so big that they were thought to have been transported by the mythological Cyclopes. An enormous amount of organized work would have been needed to build these enormous walls, indicating a hierarchical society with the capacity to mobilize substantial human resources. A few powerful men were not the only ones moving rocks. A whole community was cooperating, possibly with the help of an emerging bureaucracy. These centers, however, were hardly remote islands. Both visible and invisible networks connected them.
They were connected to other developing power centers, as well as to their local agricultural hinterlands via dirt trails and early roadways. More significantly, trade and communication throughout the Aegean were made easier by sea lines. The Mycenaeans were a part of a broader, interconnected Bronze Age civilization that exchanged not only products, but also ideas, technology, and possibly even diplomatic envoys. They learned from and finally outperformed the Minoans in their maritime talents. Knowledge their rise requires a knowledge of this connection. They were active members of a vibrant Bronze Age ecology, rather than developing in a vacuum. The interaction between local towns and the larger Mycenaean society is an intriguing but yet somewhat ambiguous facet of this time period.
Were they genuinely autonomous city-states, or did they share a common political or cultural identity? A common sense of identity, perhaps. There is little concrete proof of a single Mycenaean empire, despite the fact that they undoubtedly had similar religious beliefs, artistic styles, and subsequently the linear B script. More likely, they operated as autonomous principalities or kingdoms, possibly making alliances or waging wars as needed to further their own agendas. Ancient Greek history is replete with instances of this ongoing conflict between shared cultural characteristics and regional sovereignty, which is evidently rooted in this early Mycenaean era. Each big center seemed to be saying something along the lines of, obviously we're the best, but we'll still send our exquisite pottery to our cousins over there just to show off. Even in these early years, a strong grasp of geopolitics was demonstrated by the early towns' advantageous location, especially their closeness to fertile land and sea access. They were hubs for weaving, metallurgy, pottery, agricultural output, artisan specialization, and primitive government. Brick by brick, or more accurately, stone by purposeful stone, the foundations for the intricate palatial economics we shall talk about later were being created. The slow but constant rise in population, the rhythmic clang of tools, and the faint buzz of emerging businesses would have served as the background music for this period of expansion. As we go on this historical voyage, keep in mind that every great civilization starts with the laborious efforts of early settlers who innovate, adapt to their surroundings, and gradually lay the foundation for something genuinely massive rather than with an eruption of grandeur. Early Mycenaean towns served as the peaceful breeding grounds for a powerful civilization that would soon flourish. As the early Mycenaean communities started to establish themselves on the Greek mainland, their rough-hewn stones whispered stories of ambition and nascent power. Through the construction of the ornate shaft burials, their choice to honor their fallen became a stark example of an unprecedented cultural shift. Imagine discovering a burial site that has more than just a straightforward grave. It also has a deep rectangular hole that descends to a room that is crammed with an incredible assortment of priceless items. These were no simple funerals. During the late Middle and early Late Bronze Ages, approximately 1600–1500 BCE, they were declarations of wealth, power, and the developing social order. They offer an intriguing window into the lives of this new elite. The discovery of these burials, particularly those by Heinrich Schliemann at Mycenae in the late 19th century, was a significant occasion in archaeology, dragging the dark figures of local tradition into the harsh light of historical truth. He famously believed he had located Agamemnon's tomb. Furthermore, the sheer grandeur implied a kingly presence, even though he might have been a few centuries off. Grave Circle A and B, the two primary groups of shaft tombs at Mycenae, act as quiet, glistening textbooks on this time of change. While Tomb Circle A, located inside the later citadel walls, displays the height of this funerary extravagance, Grave Circle B, which was found later and is somewhat older, shows the earlier period.
Bodies were laid out inside these deep pits, which were frequently lined with stone. Occasionally, several people were there, along with an amazing array of grave items. We're talking about ornate ceramics, imported amber beads from the Baltic, sophisticated bronze weaponry embellished with precious metals, wonderfully carved jewelry, sparkling gold death masks, and even drinking cups made of crystal. These early aristocracies seemed to be attempting to assure a nice voyage to the afterlife, or at the very least to take their entire fortune with them. They were early forerunners of maximalist interior design, one could even joke. The size and abundance of these burial goods, just for the dead, instantly point to a civilization that was amassing substantial riches and, more crucially, consolidating it in the hands of a select few. Not everyone was buried here in the same place. These served as chieftains, warriors, and their families' last resting places, those who held sufficient power and wealth to order such extravagant arrangements for their everlasting sleep. The gold death masks include the well-known Agamemnon mask, which, let's face it, resembles a frightened walrus more than a mythical monarch, but is nevertheless stunning, are really remarkable. They point to a growing appreciation of the value of the individual ruler, and possibly even a new kind of ancestor worship, in which the dead continued to influence the lives of their surviving descendants. The act of permanently burying such priceless objects out of circulation says a lot about how valuable people are thought to be. The weapons discovered in the shaft tombs are just as instructive as the gold. Beautifully wrought bronze spearheads, daggers, and swords that are frequently engraved with hunting or fighting themes highlight this new elite's marshaling nature. These were warrior leaders, and their place at the top of society was solidified by their skill in combat, as well as their capacity to obtain exotic items through tribute or commerce. In addition to displaying amazing craftsmanship, the use of ornate daggers, such as those frequently adorned with images of lions pursuing deer, also highlights the heroic and aristocratic values that were starting to characterize Mycenaean leadership. Around these figures, the faint clang of bronze and the murmurs of old epic poetry may almost be heard. Important information about the Mycenaeans' ties to the larger Bronze Age world can also be gleaned from the shaft tombs. Extensive trade networks spanning Europe and the Near East are shown by the presence of exotic minerals such as amber, lapis, and lazuli. They weren't only isolated groups, they participated actively in a thriving global economy. Additionally, as we have explored, the aesthetic styles of numerous grave goods exhibit an obvious Minoan influence, but frequently with a distinctly Mycenaean twist. For instance, the gold rings that portray scenes of ritual use Minoan motifs, but they are reframed with a more dynamic, forceful, and occasionally overtly violent undertone. A defining characteristic of Mycenaean culture is the combination of foreign inspiration and local adaptation, which demonstrates their capacity to take in and modify outside ideas to create something wholly original. It's similar to taking a sophisticated meal from another country and adding a lot of local chili peppers to it. It's the same food, just much hotter. One of the major historiographic mysteries of the shaft graves is the abrupt explosion of wealth they symbolize. Where did all of this valuable stuff in gold come from so quickly? Was it merely the result of successful trade? Or did it entail more violent tactics like raiding, piracy, or perhaps the earliest forms of conquest? The idea that these early Mycenaean strongmen were not beyond using force to enrich themselves and their towns is supported by the stark concentration of riches and the militaristic character of many of the burial items, even though peaceful trade undoubtedly played a part. This argument draws attention to how difficult it was to distinguish between lawful trade and more coercive archaic behaviors.
It's the age-old chicken or egg dilemma. Was their military power a result of their prosperity, or did their military power help them acquire money? Maybe a little bit of both in a cycle that keeps getting stronger. Then the shaft graves mark a significant turning point. The rise of a genuinely unique Mycenaean identity, marked by a strong warrior aristocracy, concentrated riches, and exquisite craftsmanship, is reflected in these archaeological manifestations. As the monarchs of Mycenae and other locations transitioned from deep shafts to huge tholos tombs and finally to defended palaces, these ornate graves created the material and psychological foundation for the colossal palatial structures that would soon emerge. These graves' dazzling contents are more than just beautiful things. They represent a bold and concrete announcement that a new force had reached the Greek mainland and was prepared to leave its mark on history. Allow the notion of these dazzling burial goods and the proud forgotten rulers they honored to linger in your mind while the silent darkness of night grows around you. They serve as a striking reminder that even in death, these ancient individuals left us with enticing hints to unravel over the ages about their lives, beliefs, and the world they lived in. We now go on to a more intricate and structured stage of Mycenaean society, the rise of the palace economy, from the splendor of the shaft tombs where individual warrior aristocrats showcased their enormous personal wealth. Imagine a transition from a group of influential people to a highly developed centralized system in which the palace served as the hub of the administrative, religious, and economic life of an entire region, rather than just being the home of the king. Mycenaean power and organization peaked during this transition, which mostly occurred in the Late Bronze Age, between 1450 and 1200 BCE. Individual aspirations developed into a systemic machine there, carefully allocating resources on a scale never seen on the mainland. The Mycenaean palace was much more than just a residence for the wanax, the king or supreme ruler. It was frequently constructed around the center megaron, that great hall with the hearth that we previously discussed. It was a magnificently fortified complex that combined the administrative center, the workshop, the storage facility, and the religious center. Imagine it as a cross between a royal court, a contemporary distribution hub, and a rather menacing government office, all enclosed by walls substantial enough to keep out unwanted guests. We have an unparalleled glimpse into the complex mechanisms of this system from the most well-known instances, such as the palaces at Mycenae, Turin, and particularly Pylos, with its exceptionally well-preserved records. The palace economy was based on a highly structured redistribution system. The Mycenaean palace had direct control over a wide range of resources, in contrast to a contemporary market economy where things are freely exchanged, often as a kind of taxation or tribute. Agricultural products, textiles, metals, and specialist crafts were collected from the neighboring lands and then redistributed to sustain the military, religious cults, palace staff, and specialized craftspeople. This system gave the palace elite tremendous power and authority over the populace by guaranteeing that they kept control over supply and output. For its time, this top-down approach was remarkably effective, but it was also fundamentally weak if the central authority failed. Envision the flow of wheat, olive oil, and wool into the palace's store chambers, where they would be meticulously distributed in accordance with an intricate bureaucratic record. Even for a prehistoric society, that sounds like a lot of documentation. The Linear B tablets help with the careful recording needed for such a system, providing a startling glimpse into the day-to-day operations of Mycenaean government. The number of sheep, goats, and cattle in a given district, the distribution of worker rations, the distribution of chariots and armor, and lists of personnel, including specialized craftsmen like bronzesmiths, potters, and weavers, are all detailed in these clay tablets that were largely accidentally preserved when the palaces burned.
We get a glimpse of their religious rituals as they even record offerings given to different deities. The unsung heroes of this economy were the highly skilled scribes who painstakingly used a stylus to jot down transactions and inventories. They were essentially the data entry experts of the ancient world, but with significantly fewer spreadsheets and likely more job security. Additionally, the palace had direct supervision over a number of workshops and specialized crafts. Occasionally working directly for the palace, artisans created tools, weaponry, and opulent items. As a result, the palace was able to keep a close eye on quality and guarantee a consistent supply of prestige and necessary commodities. Consider the palace as an all-encompassing economic force. It strengthened its authority and promoted trade by not only consuming, but also manufacturing, turning raw resources into completed items. For example, the palaces served as important hubs for the manufacturing of bronze, a highly resource-intensive process that needed extensive planning to obtain the required tin and copper. The palace economy included labor management in addition to raw resources and completed items. The central government organized and deployed a variety of worker groups, including slaves, agricultural laborers, and highly skilled craftsmen, as documented in the Linear B tablets. This degree of control over human resources emphasizes even more the Wax's and his bureaucratic apparatus's total power. It portrays a society in which the demands of the palace system were met at the expense of personal freedom, at least for some. A scholarly discussion is highlighted by the system's extreme complexity, as evidenced by the dry but very informative Linear B recordings. Was there still a substantial role for private enterprise and autonomous economic activity? Or was this a true command economy in which the palace controlled every facet of production? It seems doubtful that all economic activities was directed through the palace, even if the tablets unmistakably demonstrate broad palatial power. Subsistence farming and small-scale local trade most likely persisted outside of its direct jurisdiction. The Mycenaean rulers were able to accumulate and preserve their enormous wealth and military power, nonetheless, because the biggest and most significant economic sectors were surely managed in a palatial manner. It's similar to attempting to determine whether the palace was a central bank with a vast side business or an overly efficient Walmart. Mycenaean civilization reached its pinnacle with the emergence of the palace economy. However, it also, in a sense, planted the seeds for its eventual downfall. Despite its efficiency, its extremely centralized structure made it brittle. The entire complex system might come undone by any large external danger, widespread crop failure, or disturbance to the central authority. Stability and steady resource flows were essential to the system's success, and the whole building might shake if those were in danger. Think about the enormous organizational achievement that was the Mycenaean palace economy as you drift off to sleep. It was a system that organized innumerable lives, turned raw materials into gold, and, thanks to its painstakingly preserved records, gives us a silent, in-depth whisper from a civilization that formerly dominated the very fabric of life on the Greek mainland. Imagine a language that has been lost for millennia, with its mysterious and silent symbols staring back from thousands of clay tablets, offering tantalizing glimpses into a forgotten world. For decades, scholars have puzzled over these mysterious markings, which were primarily found at sites like Knossos on Crete and later Bos, Mycenae, and Thebes on the mainland. While the grand palaces and the wealth of the shaft graves tell us a lot about the Mycenaeans, perhaps no single archaeological find has revealed more about their daily lives and administrative complexity than the decipherment of the Linear B script. They were aware that it was written, but what was it saying? What was the language it represented? One of the biggest conundrums in 20th century thought was this:
A linguistic mountain that needs to be climbed. When the breakthrough did occur, it was quite astounding. A monument to meticulous labor and astute deduction. It was accomplished by a young, talented British architect named Michael Ventris, not by an experienced linguist or an archaeologist. Motivated by an almost compulsive curiosity, he worked mostly in his free time. Ventris started examining the Linear B tablets for patterns. He took note of word lengths, recurrent signs, and how particular signs manifested in particular situations. He postulated that certain signs might indicate syllables rather than individual letters or entire words, a system called oscillatory. This was a significant discovery because at the time, the majority of experts thought it represented an unidentified non-Greek language, perhaps Minoan. Working closely with classical philologist John Chadwick, Ventris started testing his theories. He saw groups of signs that seemed to be proper names, especially those connected to particular places on Crete. Then, he took the bold step of speculating that the language of Linear B might actually be an early form of Greek,
which went against the conventional wisdom that Greek arrived on the mainland much later. Based on this theory, he began giving the signs phonetic meanings, carefully cross-referencing and honing his interpretations. Like a detective assembling the most intricate of coded messages, picture the hours, days, and weeks spent tediously going over each and every little mark and conceivable combination. The very thought of it is enough to bring tears to your eyes. Ventris made his historic discovery public in 1952. The first known written version of the Greek language was Linear B, which was in fact Greek, an ancient form currently called Mycenaean Greek. The academic community was rocked by this discovery. It implied that the Mycenaeans were more than merely classical Greece's forerunners. They spoke a language that the authors of the Iliad and Odyssey would eventually recognize as ancient, yet they were essentially Greeks themselves. The decipherment of Linear B instantly changed our view of Mycenaean culture. Much like learning that your great-great-great-grandparent, whom you only knew through hazy family tradition, actually left behind a painstakingly preserved diary in a language you could read with effort. Those clay tablets that had been silent suddenly started to talk loudly. They exposed the complex mechanisms of the palace economy that we just covered in the last part. Lists of people, military hardware, land holdings, offerings to the gods, and thorough inventory of items. Instead of epic poetry or historical narratives, which, although arguably less romantic, are immensely significant for comprehending the inner workings of their society, the tablets were primarily administrative records. The names of officials, Kuasiryu, who was probably a local chief or overseer, the structure of craft guilds, the trines of agricultural products, and even the names of some of their gods, such as Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Artemis, were all revealed to us. It's also interesting to note that many of these names have striking similarities to the later Olympian pantheon. The tablets, for instance, describe in detail how sheep flocks are managed, from shearing to the manufacturing and distribution of wool and textiles. They detail how bronze was distributed to smiths for the manufacture of tools and weapons, demonstrating the tight control the palace had over this essential metal. They include information about the Mycenaean military apparatus, including a catalog of armor and chariots. A highly centralized, painstakingly run, and sometimes inflexibly controlled society is vividly depicted by this dry bureaucratic data. The ability of even the most ordinary administrative documents to serve as the keys to revealing important historical facts decades later is evidence of this. The actual nature of the Linear B tablets, however, remains a historiographic mystery, despite this significant discovery. They teach us relatively little about the history, political events, myths, and literature of the Mycenaeans because they are mostly administrative documents.
They are not chronicles. They are receipts. We don't have their dynastic conflicts, their philosophical reflections, or their rendition of the Trojan War. This indicates that even while we have a remarkable understanding of their administration and economics, a large portion of their cultural and political narrative is still unknown, maybe awaiting the discovery of a Mycenaean Rosetta Stone with further narrative texts. It's similar to having access to a business's ledger, but not its yearly reports or staff manuals, which leaves many questions on the how and why of their ambitious plans unanswered. In addition, the conditions under which they were preserved, baked hard by the fires that destroyed the palaces, provide a terrifying perspective. Long-term storage was not intended for these tablets. These were transient documents that might have been meant to be deleted or recycled. They serve as ghastly monuments to their own demise because their survival is directly related to the terrible events that drove the Mycenaean civilization to its knees. The fact that the same fires that destroyed their existence also left behind its most personal details for us to consider thousands of years later is a sinister irony. Thus,
Consider the amazing voyage of discovery that was the decipherment of linear B as your mind wanders and your awareness becomes more relaxed. With the administrative machinery of the palace economy humming along, and the secrets of linear B starting to whisper their tales of meticulous organization, it serves as a potent reminder that sometimes the best insights into the past come not from grand monuments, but from the humble, everyday records left behind by diligent scribes, whose meticulous work, almost by accident, became a beacon, illuminating the forgotten world of the Mycenaeans. We now move on to Mycenaean warfare, a less tranquil but no less distinctive feature of their culture. Picture a terrain with strongholds scattered throughout it. Their enormous fortifications reveal a people that are not just ready for battle, but also appear to be skilled at it. The Mycenaeans were fundamentally a martial people, and their art, archaeology, and even administrative documents all attest to their marshaling skills. The Mycenaean warrior is a key component of their identity. From the earliest shaft grave burials with elaborate bronze weapons to the later representations on fresco and seal stones. A nucleus of heavily equipped soldiers and an elite of chariot drivers probably made up the majority of the Mycenaean force. Particularly from Knossos and Pios, the Linear B tablets offer comprehensive records of chariots, chariot components, horses, and even specialist individuals involved in their upkeep and deployment. Although they might not have been the masked shock cavalry of later times, these chariots were probably employed as mobile fire platforms for archers and javelin throwers, or as prestige and command symbols for senior leaders. Imagine a Mycenaean general, or one-axe, resplendent in his bronze armor, driving a two-wheeled chariot into combat, an absolutely terrifying sight for any adversary. Chariots were considered an elite weapon since they were extremely costly to make and maintain, needing skilled artisans, trained horses, and a lot of resources. Without a doubt, you wouldn't simply stop by the neighborhood chariot dealership for a quick test drive. But the infantry would have been crucial for the most of the combat. The Dendra panoply, a nearly whole set of bronze plates discovered in a tomb close to Dendra, paints a striking image of Mycenaean soldiers' ability to defend themselves. They wore highly advanced bronze armor. Although mobility would have been sacrificed, this armor, which was made up of several overlapping bronze plates held together by leather thongs, would have provided significant protection against bronze weapons. The sheer strain of battling in such a heavy suit under the Mediterranean sun is unimaginable. It likely felt more like a really hot metallic sauna with spears added than elegant battle. Large figure-eight shields, or tower shields, frequently composed of several layers of oxhide, afforded complete body protection, while helmets, typically made from boar's tusk blades sewn onto a leather cap, provided protection for the head.
They used bows and arrows, spears, daggers, and long bronze swords, frequently with ornate hilts, as attacking weapons. Although slashing was an option, thrusting was the primary use of the swords. The most common weapon for the average soldier would have been the omnipresent spear, which could be used for both throwing and thrusting. An extremely well-organized military-industrial complex controlled by the palace is demonstrated by the evidence of massive weapon production, ranging from bronze ingots to completed weaponry. The fact that there are such elaborate, meticulously made weapons and armor suggests that civilization valued and made significant investments in its marshaling capacities. Perhaps the most enduring example of their emphasis on fighting and defense is found in Mycenaean fortifications. It is very amazing to see the enormous cyclopean walls of citadels, such as Turin's in Mycenae. In order to provide a water supply during sieges, these walls, which are made of massive, unworked stones joined together without cement, frequently contain springs or wells. At Mycenae, the ornate lion gate with its recognizable sculptured relief provided a strong entrance, and defenders were able to launch surprise attacks thanks to concealed posts and sally ports. These obstacles weren't merely ornamental. They were strong defensive buildings made to resist protracted sieges and invading forces. These barriers' ongoing building and strengthening point to a civilization where threats, both internal and external, were a constant worry. They seem to be saying, "Welcome to our modest home. The entry is guarded by two-tone pebbles. Please ignore them. They're merely a show." The main topic of continuous discussion is the nature of Mycenaean warfare itself. Did they undertake significant abroad voyages, or were they mostly involved in interpalatial rivalries on the mainland? Artistic representations of warriors and chariots allude to defensive requirements or internal conflicts. But if the mythical Trojan War is a historical event, it suggests coalition warfare and long-distance campaigns. The existence of such a strong and well-equipped Mycenaean military undoubtedly makes such missions possible, even though the archaeological evidence for the Trojan War is complicated and up for debate. Additionally, military troops and equipment are mentioned in the Linear B tablets, suggesting logistical capacity for larger deployments. In addition, the Mycenaeans were known to use mercenaries, or at the very least, to contact closely with foreign combatants. In the Linear B tablets, figures described as eta, or followers, occasionally appear alongside foreign names that reflect a diverse military force, potentially referring to a form of warrior elite. This suggests a dynamic setting where talent may have come from a variety of places within the Aegean, and military might was a valuable commodity. A highly developed military structure is suggested by the concept of professional warriors, possibly even fighting for pay. The ongoing state of readiness, the investment in military infrastructure, and the advanced weapons all point to a civilization where warfare was a continual threat. Their early ascent and supremacy in the Aegean was surely aided by their strong emphasis on military might and defense. However, it also portrays a society that is inherently unstable, where power struggles are ongoing, and peace, if it exists at all, is brittle and only maintained by the might of the strongest walls and the sharpest swords. Let your thoughts wander to the clanking of bronze armor, the steady tempo of marching feet, and the imposing look of those cyclopean walls as the night grows quieter. In addition to being highly skilled artists and highly developed administrators, the Mycenaeans were also skilled warriors, and their legacy is preserved not only in gold and clay, but also in the fortresses that still stand over their ancestral homelands. Beyond the imposing walls and the clanking of bronze armor, the Mycenaeans' legacy is more subdued, but no less captivating. Their architecture and art are unique. Imagine elaborate gold work gleaming in gloomy graves, enormous unmortared stones creating doors that have withstood the test of time, and colorful frescoes decorating castle walls.
This edifice was more than just a gorgeous ornament or a useful structure. It was a powerful manifestation of their power, identity, and beliefs, combining a distinctively Mycenaean sensibility with Minoan influences. Despite possibly lacking the fluidity of Minoan art, their creative production had a strong vitality and a potent simplicity that spoke a great deal about their warrior culture. First, let's look at their architecture, especially the imposing palatial fenters. As we have seen, their fortress's use of cyclopean masonry was its distinguishing characteristic. These walls were so massive that the Greeks thought only the legendary Cyclops could have constructed them. They were made of massive, irregularly shaped limestone rocks that occasionally weighed many tons and were joined together with little to no mortar. It is astounding how much work and engineering skill it took to move and position these stones without the use of contemporary equipment. It demonstrates a remarkable degree of central planning, organized labor, and resolve. These weren't only obstacles for defense, they were also potent representations of authority, meant to evoke fear and obedience in anybody who came near them. Imagine feeling the palpable weight of old strength while standing at the base of the Lion Gate at Mycenae, dwarfed by those enormous stones. The palaces were located inside these walled enclosures, and although they were functionally similar at all locations, they each had their own distinctive features. The Megaron was the center of all Mycenaean palaces, a vast rectangular hall with a circular hearth in the center, encircled by 4 columns that support the roof with a light well and an upper level. In addition to being the audience chamber and throne room, this Megaron was probably used for religious events. It served as the palace's political and ceremonial center. This architectural decision shows a different emphasis, a focal point for a single supreme king, and possibly a more formal hierarchical court structure than the more open, labyrinthine Minoan palatial layouts. Picture the Wanax, the monarch, sitting in front of the roaring hearth, making decisions, collecting tribute, and hosting feasts. The palaces included a sophisticated system of courtyards and storerooms that extended beyond the Megaron. Do you recall the cultic areas, residential quarters, workshops, and linear B tablets? Their design was determined by the pragmatic requirements of a centralized government and economy. However, a distinct aesthetic sensibility was also present. At other locations, like Estirin, their engineering innovativeness is demonstrated by intricate drainage systems and even basic indoor plumbing. These monuments' meticulous design and enormous scale reveal a culture that can muster a vast amount of knowledge and resources. Let's now discuss their artwork. Despite being greatly influenced by Minoan art, Mycenaean art evolved a unique personality of its own. Mycenaean frescoes usually included processions, hunts, and conflict scenes, but Minoan frescoes typically featured graceful people, serene ceremonies, and vibrant natural settings. The realistic fluidity of Minoan art is clearly giving way to a more structured, frequently more strict and potent style. We saw soldiers wearing their characteristic tusk helmets, storming chariots, heroic jewelry, and boars. This artistic emphasis, which honors military skill and the power of its leaders, is entirely consistent with the idea of a warrior society. Even though they have faded with time, the vivid cues nevertheless allude to the grandeur that would have attracted people to these opulent rooms. Additionally, their pottery changed over time, shifting from Minoan-inspired patterns to distinctive Mycenaean styles, which were subsequently distinguished by more intricate pictorial representations, abstract patterns, and stylized marine motifs. Mycenaean pottery's broad dissemination throughout the Aegean and beyond is evidence of their powerful cultural influence and vast trading networks. In many respects, it was the common Tupperware of the Late Bronze Age, which was used in a variety of settings from Egypt to Anatolia.
Their metalwork is arguably among the most beautiful examples of Mycenaean art, especially the metal and gold artifacts discovered in the shaft graves and, subsequently, these thalos tombs. A mastery of metallurgy and an acute creative eye are displayed in the exquisite gold cups, the gold death masks, and the intricate daggers inlaid with scenes of lion hunts, employing various colored metals to achieve amazing detail. These weren't manufactured in large quantities. They were luxury items made by extremely talented craftspeople for the affluent, and they were both beautiful pieces of art and status symbols. For example, the well-known gold cup of Nestor, discovered at Mycenae, albeit it is a larger version than Homer's description, demonstrates their capacity to produce items that are both aesthetically pleasing and useful. The function and significance of some Mycenaean stylized forms, especially the Mycenaean goddesses or female figurines, are a fascinating open historiographic mystery in Mycenaean art. Although they are frequently seen in cultic settings, it is unclear exactly what function they serve, as priestesses, deities, or just followers. In contrast to the more realistic Minoan female portrayals, they are usually rigid, rather schematic figures, which raises concerns regarding changes in religious iconography and maybe societal roles. For the Mycenaean people who created and worshipped these figures, what did they represent? As the outside world calms, the mystery is only heightened by the archaeological record's reticence on this issue. Allow your mind to roam around the Mycenaean palace's magnificent entrances and colorful halls. Imagine the builders heaving those enormous stones into place, the painters adding life to stucco walls, and the artisans painstakingly creating gold and bronze. Their architecture and artwork are more than just exquisite artifacts. These are compelling stories that tell us about a people who lived with a strong sense of their own authority and position in the world, built strong and fought hard. As the Mycenaean civilization developed, creating its magnificent palaces and unique art, its vast trading networks served as a vital foundation for its wealth and influence. Imagine the Aegean Sea as a freeway, teeming with ships, transporting ideas and things over great distances rather than as a barrier. There were other Mycenaeans. They played a significant role in the intricately linked economy of the Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age. A key component of their opulent wealth and power was their capacity to distribute completed goods and procure raw materials. It is impossible to overestimate the importance of trade for the Mycenaean economy, which extends well beyond the borders of mainland Greece. Despite having rich agricultural land, mainland Greece lacks vital raw materials, especially metals. Copper and tin were both necessary for the production of bronze, the age's defining substance. In regions like Cyprus and Anatolia, copper was easily available. A more difficult and important task was acquiring tin, a rarer material that had to be supplied from much further away, possibly as far away as Cornwall in Britain, or from Central Asia. These metals were necessary for the Mycenaean military machine to make its weapons, and for its artisans to create their luxury items and tools. Therefore, the Mycenaeans were motivated from the beginning by the need to create and preserve trustworthy trade routes. They became powerful seamen thanks to their maritime skills, which were surely refined via contact with the Minoans. Mycenaean vessels could traverse the Aegean and beyond, while possibly being smaller than some of their Near Eastern counterparts. Archaeological sites around the Mediterranean, including the Levant, modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, Cyprus, Sicily, and even as far west as Italy, have shown Mycenaean pottery, especially its characteristic harsh style, and later widespread pictorial pottery. This massive distribution serves as a concrete example of their broad commercial reach. It seems as though they were establishing delivery services similar to the old-fashioned Mycenaean Express throughout the modern world, except the online tracking. What precisely were they exchanging?
Minoans probably sold high-quality manufactured goods for export, including textiles, fragrant oils, and pottery. For instance, the manufacture of scented oil is mentioned multiple times in the Linear B tablets, indicating that it was a major export good. Imagine these aromatic oils, possibly infused with regional flowers and herbs, being highly valued in Egyptian or Near Eastern palaces. Additionally, they may have exported wine and some kind of skilled handicraft. The list was important from an import perspective. For the manufacturing of bronze, copper, and tin were essential. Gold, silver, and lead used for money, albeit not in the contemporary sense, and luxury goods were among the other essential imports. A really worldwide reach of their trading networks is remarkably demonstrated by exotic raw materials, such as semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic region for jewelry, and ivory from elephants or hippos for carvings. The idea of these materials making the slow but steady journey from the depths of Asia to the Greek coast is astounding. After all, this wasn't Amazon Prime. It was more along the lines of, if the winds are good and there are no pirates around, maybe it'll get here in a few months. Scholarly debate over the nature of these trade connections is fascinating. Did the palaces have a strong hold on it, or was it mostly a straight trade between merchants? The palaces were crucial to the planning and management of trade, according to the evidence found in the Linear B tablets. They would have been in charge of obtaining raw materials, producing items in royal workshops, and finally distributing them. In addition to further solidifying the palace's economic dominance, this concentration would have guaranteed the state a consistent supply of essential commodities. Independent traders and smaller-scale commerce, possibly dealing in less strategically important items, most certainly coexisted with the palace system. The evidence of Minoan towns or trading outposts developed overseas is one fascinating feature. For example, archaeological discoveries at Miletus on the Anatolian coast point to a substantial Minoan presence, possibly even a colony or a powerful trading factory. This suggests a proactive strategy for protecting resources and trading routes, possibly even with some degree of political or military clout. It wasn't merely a passive conversation. The quest of economic gain was active. The Mycenaean palaces would have suffered greatly if these complex trade networks had collapsed during the larger Late Bronze Age collapse, which we'll talk about later. Their economy, military, and very way of life would have been greatly hampered in the absence of a steady supply of vital metals and other raw materials. The fraying and breaking of the long-distance connections made the vulnerability of such a highly interconnected system glaringly obvious. Imagine those old ships carrying valuable goods traveling beneath the starry Mediterranean sky as you become more attuned to the calm of the night. The Mycenaeans were more than just warriors on land. They were skilled traders and navigators, and their international ties were just as important to their dominance as their Cyclopean fortifications. The intricate web of global trade was the foundation of their success, an ongoing reminder of the old world's connection. After studying the Mycenaean world's economic engine, we now look inward to examine this amazing civilization's spiritual environment, their religious convictions and rituals. Imagine a society in which the divine was present in every aspect of daily existence, and where rituals were carried out to ensure abundant crops, fruitful hunts, and victorious battles, and where the ancient gods' echoes were already influencing the Greek pantheon. Although we mostly rely on archaeological discoveries, artistic representations, and the intriguing but disjointed hints from the Linear B tablets, our knowledge of Mycenaean religion is still lacking. Their sacred world is fascinatingly depicted by what we do know. The existence of gods whose names are remarkably recognizable to anyone familiar with later classical Greek mythology is among the most startling revelations from the Linear B tablets.
Zeus, Dwe, Hera, Era, Poseidon, Poseido, Artemias, Artemaito, Dionys, Dionyso, and even a goddess known as Botnia, a mistress or lady who is frequently connected to nature or particular realms, are mentioned. This important finding shows that the Olympian pantheon's origins date much earlier than previously thought, to the Bronze Age. The Mycenaeans carefully crafted their divine ensemble, almost as if they were laying the groundwork for the spectacular tales that would eventually enthrall the ancient world. The linguistic continuity is indisputable and extremely important, even though the relationships are not necessarily one-to-one, and the characteristics of these early gods may have been slightly different from those of their later classical equivalents. Archaeological data gives these views a tangible component.
Dedicated cultic spaces or shrines have been discovered during excavations at several Mycenaean sites, both inside the palaces and in other buildings. These frequently have cult statues and altars with tables. The Mycenaean figurines are typically miniature, stylized terracotta figures that frequently show women standing with their arms up, occasionally with kids or possessing particular qualities. Their precise meaning is still up for controversy among scholars, as we previously explored. Are they images of priestesses, goddesses, or just worshippers? In any case, their pervasiveness indicates a significant devotional component to Mycenaeans' everyday existence. It's simple to see these little figures playing a major role in devotional practices or worship in the home. Mycenaean religious practice was definitely centered around silent companions in daily prayers, rites, and offerings. Olive oil, wine, grain, honey, and even animals for sacrifice are among the sacrifices made to the gods that are documented in the Linear B tablets. Certain religious holidays and ceremonial feasts are also included. The material evidence points to a great emphasis on communal feasting and offerings as a means of honoring the gods and securing divine favor, even though we lack comprehensive liturgical texts. Even with the divine, eating together would have promoted societal harmony and strengthened the authority of people in charge of such rituals. It serves as a reminder that abstract theology wasn't the only aspect of ancient religion. It was frequently extremely pragmatic, based on the perceived requirements of the society and the rhythms of agricultural life. In religious life, the palace and its king probably played a crucial role. The Wux likely held the position of top religious authority, supervising cults and carrying out important rites. In addition to being the political and military commander, the ruler's status as a mediator between the divine and human worlds would have been validated and their authority further cemented by this concentration of secular and holy power. The megaron, the center of the palace, can be viewed as both a throne room and a ceremonial area where significant religious privileges may have been exercised, skillfully fusing spirituality and statecraft. In Mycenaean religion, the extent of Minoan influence is a major open historiographic mystery. The Mycenaeans maintained their unique characteristics even though they obviously accepted some Minoan religious iconography and customs, especially from earlier eras, such as bull images and certain female characters. Were there significant distinctions in their religious perspective, or did they merely include Minoan deities into their own pantheon? For example, the specific characteristics of the Potenia figure appear to have their origins in Minoan mistress figures. Nevertheless, she occurs in a variety of forms in Mycenaean contexts, such as mistress of the Animans or mistress of the labyrinth, indicating a complex absorption. This ongoing discussion emphasizes how difficult it may be to separate cultural effects when there is little direct textual evidence. It's similar to attempting to determine whether your friend's peculiar behaviors were created by them or whether they were inherited from their parents. Probably a little amount of both, but good luck establishing it beyond a reasonable doubt. Given the intricate shaft graves and tholos tombs, there may also be evidence of hero cults or ancestor veneration in the Mycenaean civilization. However, it is less distinct than in later Greek periods.
Respect for the influential dead, ongoing sacrifices, and the construction of such large monuments for them all point to a belief in their enduring influence or an effort to use their power from beyond the grave. This respect for former leaders may have been used to uphold social structures and justify the control of their successors. Let your thoughts wander to the old temples, the flickering lamps, and the silent supplications made to gods whose names are still remembered as the night grows darker. Although there is considerable mystery surrounding the Mycenaean religious beliefs, they indicate a spiritual realm that is closely linked to the authority of their rulers, the natural rhythms of existence, and the fundamental components of a pantheon that would eventually inspire many myths and tales. Similar to their palaces, their gods were evidence of a sophisticated, well-organized, and highly esteemed society. After studying the Mycenaean spiritual environment, we go on to the latter part of their society and look at the complex social structure that shaped their environment. Imagine a strict but frequently shockingly intricate social hierarchy in which every individual, from the most important monarch to the lowest worker, had a specific position. There was no equality in Mycenaean society, with a large network of experts and commoners supporting the mighty palace elite at its top. It was a complex pyramid. Once more, the priceless, albeit occasionally dry, Linear B tablets provide our main window into the structure. Archaeological evidence of homes, burials, and grave items also helps. The one-axe was at the highest top of Mycenaean society. This person, who was basically the king or supreme ruler, had a great deal of power. According to the tablets, the one-axe was the most powerful religious leader, the commander of the army, and the head of the palace economy. They also controlled enormous land holdings, distributed resources, and oversaw the administration of justice. He most likely inherited his status from strong dynastic families. His throne room was the Megaron, the palace's center hall, which symbolized his centralized rule. He wasn't merely a boss. The political, economic, and spiritual life of the entire region revolved around him. His presence would have likely been rather intimidating, and his word would have literally been law. The Lagatas, a high-ranking official, was located directly beneath the one-axe. It is generally accepted that the Lagatas was a military leader, probably controlling the army or a particular military force, and perhaps second only to the one-axe in terms of overall authority, though his precise role is up for scholarly debate. Additionally, he appears to have possessed significant property holdings that the one-axe probably gave him in return for his military service. He can be compared to the Mycenaean counterpart of a strong duke or general who is prepared to ride into combat at the king's order. The Mycenaeans seem to have an unwritten rule. I will take care of the sheep, you will take care of the swords, and together we will take care of the divine. Other significant administrators and bureaucrats, sometimes known as the entourage of the one-axe, were located farther down the hierarchy. These included the Borokoret, district governors, the Koreta, deputy governors, and other scribes and overseers. Local headmen or chieftains functioning at a lower level of government could also be referred to as quasi-ryu. These people oversaw output, managed resources, and ensured the redistributive system ran smoothly, forming the bureaucratic core of the royal economy. They were the ones who painstakingly maintained the Linear B records, making sure that each worker, each jug of oil, and each sheep were present. The complex network of command and control extended from the palace to the most remote areas of its domain. The skilled artists and craftspeople were beneath this administrative elite. A variety of vocations are listed on the Linear B tablets: weavers, masons, potters, carpenters, perfumers, goldsmiths, and bronzesmiths. Many of these talented people probably lived in the palace's complex or close by, worked directly for the palace, and were paid with supplies and meals. Because of their specialized skills and close ties to the palace economy, they would have had a higher prestige than other workers.
They were the backbone of Mycenaean manufacturing, turning raw materials into luxury products and weapons that characterized their society. Farmers and agricultural workers, however, made up the great majority of the population. These people worked the land, raised cattle, and produced the excess food that fed the entire system from their communities strewn over the opulent realm. Their lives, which served as the fundamental basis for the Mycenaean state, were moderately taxing and regulated by the seasons, as well as the palace's requests for tribute and taxes. Although the tablets don't tell us their personal histories, they do provide us with a glimpse of the size of the population under the palace's rule by listing the number of men, women, and children, sometimes grouped by occupation or social standing. As they tend to fields that have been farmed continuously for thousands of years, it is simple to picture their daily routine from sunrise to sunset. Slaves Duero and Duera were at the bottom of the social scale in Linear B. The tablets show that slavery was practiced, with records of both male and female slaves occasionally connected to cultic or particular responsibilities. It is difficult to accurately determine their numbers and specific roles. However, their existence draws attention to the negative aspects of this hierarchical society, where forced labor was a component of the economy. Nearly every ancient culture shared this sad truth, a sharp reminder of how many great accomplishments were based on societal injustices. A prominent academic discussion revolves over the extent of social mobility in an inflexible system. Were positions mostly predetermined by birth, or could people advance through the ranks depending on their abilities or military prowess? Even though the system seems very well organized, it is possible that outstanding craftsmen or soldiers gained favor and rose in the hierarchy. Nonetheless, the basic framework of the palace economy and the obvious division between the governing class and the general public imply that most people's opportunities for upward mobility were probably restricted. Think about the intricate human fabric that comprised Mycenaean culture as your mind drifts into rest. From the mighty Wenax ruling his realm to the industrious scribe carving symbols into clay, and the innumerable farmers cultivating the land, each was essential to this amazing Bronze Age civilization's complex mechanism. They lived in a world of hierarchy and order, a testimony to a highly structured society with a complex social system that was established on the basis of centralized power and collective work. In order to visualize life in the palaces itself, let's pull aside the hefty gates of the Mycenaean citadels and enter. These imposing stone strongholds were vibrant, independent microcosms rather than merely royal homes, the hubs of their respective regions' economies, administrations, and ceremonies. Imagine the clatter of artisans, the murmur of officials, the quiet dignity of rituals, and the unceasing hum of activity all taking place inside those massive cyclopean walls. For the elite, it was a life of affluence and power, supported by the hard work of many. But it also required careful planning and unwavering attention to detail. As we recall, the Megaron was at the center of the palace. With its 4 columns and central hearth, this opulent hall functioned as both the audience chamber and the official throne room. The Wenax would have conducted court here, received ambassadors, presided over official events, and possibly even took part in religious rituals. The Megaron would have had a rich background for the everyday exercise of authority, thanks to its ornately painted floor and frescoed walls that featured scenes of bravery, hunting, or ceremonial processions. Imagine the hearth's flickering firelight, creating swirling shadows on these colorful paintings, giving the proceedings a nearly theatrical feel. It resembled a multi-purpose, lavishly decorated communal center in the ancient world, but with more armed guards and fewer public bathrooms. There were many connected rooms all throughout the Megaron.
Jars of grain, wine, olive oil, and other goods meticulously stocked on Linear B tablets fill storerooms to bursting. Bronzesmiths, goldsmiths, potters, perfumers, weavers, and other skilled craftspeople worked in workshops to create things for the palace and trade. And scribes kept careful records of all transactions and resources in administrative offices. The noises of manufacturing and the soft scratch of styluses on clay would have filled these spaces with a constant bustle of activity. The palace was a huge producer that turned raw materials into riches and power in addition to being a consumer of things. The necessities of the wax and his entourage, as well as the requirements of the redistributive economy, would have determined the daily schedule inside the palace. In the mornings, tasks could have included preparing military drills, sending messengers to monitor agricultural output, or going over the inventories from the previous day. In order to meet quotas and preserve quality, artisans would work throughout the day,
possibly under the close supervision of overseers. In the Megaron, evenings may have featured lavish banquets, with food and beverages served from exquisite ceramic and metal containers that served as social gatherings and showcases of the palace's generosity and wealth. With a clear chain of command and a sophisticated bureaucracy, it was a well-oiled machine. The palace's enormous landholdings and the tributes gathered from nearby settlements would have provided the opulent residents with plenty of food and provisions. The Linear B tablets describe a diverse diet that includes animals like sheep, beef, and swine, as well as grains, olives, grapes, figs, and other vegetables. Both staple products, olive oil and fine wine, would have been eaten in large quantities. One major benefit of living under the palace system was the assured food supply, which provided people under its direct control with food even in times of scarcity. Daily life was likewise influenced by the palace's defensive posture. Life within would have seemed somewhat safe because of the enormous cyclopean walls that surrounded it, which frequently included concealed posterns and small, easily defendable gates. Nonetheless, the guards' continual presence and the artwork with a military theme imply that alertness was always on the mind. There was a subliminal understanding of the necessity of protection and control, even amid the extravagance. These were not, in the contemporary sense, friendly, open communities. They were strongholds of power. The level of privacy and personal life in these highly centralized systems is the subject of an intriguing academic discussion. The royal families and high officials' household arrangements are less obvious, even though we can recreate the palace's public and administrative functions. Even among the rich, was life more communal or were there designated private quarters? Although the architectural remnants indicate that some parts were more private than others, the overall effect is one of a system designed more for administrative effectiveness and public show than for personal comfort as we could define it now. You might still have a retinue of attendants and guards during your private moments if you were a Mycenaean queen. The lives of the vast majority of people, including farmers and laborers, were closely intertwined with the palace beyond its borders. Their labor created it, their produce nourished it, and its rules shaped their lives, at least in part. Even though they did not reside in the palace, their lives were centered around its requirements, which served as the basis for the opulent lifestyle that the aristocracy there enjoyed. Everything was drawn into the palace's orbit like a magnet for wealth and authority. Allow the sounds of the old palace to fill your imagination as your eyelids grow heavy. The rustle of scribes at their work, the distant clang of the smithy, and the whisper of voices in the Megaron. Life in these imposing fortresses was a tribute to Mycenaean organization, a synthesis of imperial grandeur, bureaucratic accuracy, and perpetual preparedness.
The simpler, dispersed towns of the past are a world away. It really was the center of their thriving, strong society. It's important to realize that the Mycenaean universe was a collection of separate, yet culturally related palatial centers, rather than a single monolithic empire after studying the general operations of a Mycenaean palace. This leads us to the intriguing subject of regional differences between these strongholds of Mycenaean authority. Consider a tapestry that is stitched with common threads but has distinct patterns in each section that represent regional resources, historical trends, and particular goals. Even though Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos all have basic traits in common, their unique archaeological signatures show minor but important variations that highlight their unique identities and connections within the larger Aegean environment. Naturally, Mycenae stands out as the namesake of the civilization and is sometimes regarded as the first city in the Mycenaean universe. Its prominent location on a hilltop that dominates the Argolid Plain, its massive cyclopean walls, and the famous Lion Gate, a feat of architecture and magnificent sculpture, all attest to its supreme rank.
The magnificent shaft graves and later tholos tombs found inside or close to the citadel walls point to a lengthy period of wealthy and powerful rulers, possibly with a focus on dynastic continuity and military prowess. Mycenae has a certain mythological weight that distinguishes it, as does its apparent grandeur and connection to later Greek mythology, such as the House of Atreus and Agamemnon. It is a perfect example of a fortified stronghold because of its defensive architecture, which takes advantage of the natural topography. Tiryns, which is not far from Mycenae, provides a different but no less striking viewpoint. Tiryns, which rises nearly vertically from the Agalid plain on a low rocky spur, is well known for its incredibly enormous Cyclopean walls, which are in some places even more enormous than those of Mycenae. In the Homeric epic, these walls were dubbed the Tiryns of the Great Walls. Its palace structure demonstrates an impressive degree of engineering skill, possibly even outperforming Mycenae in several technical areas, especially its intricate drainage system and underground passages for water storage, as well as a powerful military installation. Because Tiryns was closer to the sea, some academics speculate that it may have had a more direct relationship to nautical activity. Even though it wasn't a direct port, the variations in internal design and wall structure quietly allude to various architectural goals, or possibly different reactions to perceived dangers. The defensive characteristics of Pylos, which is situated in the southwest Peloponnesus' fertile Mycenae, stand in sharp contrast. The palace of Nestor at Pylos was comparatively undefended in contrast to the Agalids' massively constructed citadels. There has been a lot of scholarly discussion about this odd absence of enormous walls. Does it point to a more tranquil setting in Mycenae, or maybe a different kind of regional dominance that depended more on political stability or diplomatic skill than on military defenses? Ironically, the palace's remarkable preservation results from its destruction by fire, which baked the thousands of linear B tablets that were discovered there rather than from its walls. Perhaps more comprehensive than any other site, these tablets offer an unmatched glimpse into the inner workings of a Mycenaean palace economy. The Pylos record's immense number and level of information point to a highly bureaucratic and centralized government that, at least in its later stages, may have been more concerned with resource distribution and agricultural management than with overt military posture. Thebes, in Boeotia, and Okemenos are two other notable Mycenaean centers that have distinctive traits of their own. For example, Thebes has produced a substantial collection of linear B tablets, including a noteworthy discovery from the Cardemia fortress that highlights its significance as a hub for government and commerce. It was a major agricultural center due to its location in a fertile plateau, and its archives show ties to other areas. Although they have not been thoroughly studied, Iolcos exhibit Mycenaean presence and authority in the northern regions of their cultural sphere, which may allow them to control access to fertile agricultural fields and routes.
The distinctions extend beyond architectural style and military emphasis. They are also evident in the subtleties of their art and pottery. Regional workshops frequently created variations, sometimes somewhat different in shape, design, or favorite motifs, even though a common Mycenaean style predominated. Archaeologists can follow trade routes and cultural exchanges between the various centers with the aid of these regional dialects in material culture. The specific sort of Mycenaean pottery discovered in Egypt, for example, may have come from a particular mainland city, suggesting its unique trading relations. The exact nature of the political link between these autonomous palace states is a fundamental historiographic puzzle surrounding these geographical variances. As later Greek mythology frequently imply, were they constantly at battle with one another? Or did they engage in alliances and rivalries that changed throughout time, maintaining a tenuous balance of power? Common cultural characteristics and economic interconnectedness point to times of cooperation, even though fortifications suggest a necessity for defense against both external and possibly internal dangers. It resembles a group of strong competing siblings. Although they are essentially members of the same family, they occasionally quarrel and occasionally work together. The decentralized character of Mycenaean power is emphasized by these regional variations. A single Mycenaean empire with a single capital did not exist. Instead, it was a system of autonomous kingdoms that all added to the period's general cultural and economic vitality. However, each is extremely protective and proud of its own territory. Think of the rich tapestry of the Mycenaean universe as your mind starts to calm. A group of proud, strong centers rather than a single monolith, each adding a distinct thread to the overall story of this great Bronze Age civilization. Even within a common cultural realm, their unique personalities serve as a tribute to the wide range of human experience. After exploring the Mycenaean world's internal geography, including its opulent economies and unique regional hubs, we now look outside the Aegean to comprehend their diplomatic ties with other late Bronze Age superpowers. Imagine a society where intricate political ties, royal marriages, gift-giving, and occasionally the sound of battle are all interspersed, all carried out between powerful empires. There were other players besides the Mycenaeans. They interacted with civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, and were firmly rooted in an advanced international system. Our understanding of these relationships is based on an intriguing combination of artistic analogies, comparative textual research from foreign archives, and archaeology. Among the most convincing sources of information about Mycenaean diplomacy are the records of other Bronze Age nations. For example, many academics believe that the Mycenaean kingdom, or at least a large portion of it, corresponds to a territory called Ahiawa, which is mentioned in Hittite records from Hattusa, the Hittite capital in Anatolia. The Hittite monarch and the king of Ahiawa are described in these documents as having occasionally cordial but also occasionally tense encounters, during which they debate trade, political disagreements, and even military interventions. The Tawagalawa letter is one particularly interesting text that suggests direct Mycenaean engagement in regional politics far from their homeland by mentioning a military fight over a client state in western Anatolia. This allows us to see the Mycenaean wax participating in high-level diplomacy comparable to that of the Hittite emperors and pharaohs, a very strong presence on the global scene. Egyptian archives also attest to Mycenaean connections farther east. Various monarchs from the Near East sent letters to the Egyptian pharaoh, which are part of the well-known Amanna letters, a cache of diplomatic communication from the 14th century BC discovered in Egypt. Even while no letters from Ahiawa or directly from Mycenaean rulers have been identified with certainty, this remains a significant scholarly puzzle in and of itself, possibly suggesting a separate diplomatic position or communication method.
It is common to find Mycenaean pottery and commodities in Egypt. The New Kingdom Egyptian tomb paintings show tribute bearers carrying presents from countries on the other side of the ocean. Additionally, although if they are frequently generic, some artistic details allude to Aegean guests, which implies at least a robust business relationship and possibly a more nuanced diplomatic one. In Bronze Age diplomacy, the exchange of gifts was essential for building alliances and establishing prestige, even if it wasn't always done through official letter writing. In order to strengthen their bonds, kings in the Near East traded expensive presents, precious stones, gold, silver, exotic animals, and exquisitely manufactured items, as we know from textual evidence. The quantity of imported luxury items discovered in Mycenaean palaces and tombs, such as Egyptian scarabs close to Eastern cylinder seals and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, indicates that the Mycenaeans were active recipients, suggesting they were also sending valuable gifts in return, even though direct Mycenaean diplomatic gifts are more difficult to find in foreign archives. Imagine a strategic exchange of luxury when a Mycenaean ambassador arrives at the court of a Hittite king bearing exquisitely crafted bronze weapons and fragrant oils. Trade itself, which frequently preceded and facilitated political ties, was an important type of international engagement outside of formal diplomacy. By navigating the Mediterranean, Mycenaean vessels made communication with Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Western Mediterranean. The foundation for more established ties was laid by these business endeavors, which frequently entailed direct communication with local merchants and rulers.
A dynamic and interconnected edigan within a larger global economy is depicted by the extensive dispersion of Mycenaean pottery, which is frequently found in settings with other foreign commodities. But in the Late Bronze Age, diplomatic relations weren't always amicable. Changing alliances, military rivalry, and sporadic battles were the hallmarks of the era. The Hittite texts' allusions to Mycenaean military participation in Anatolia imply that they were active participants in the regional power conflicts rather than just passive traders. Was securing trade routes, gaining reputation, or a need for resources the driving forces behind this expansionist strategy? Historians continue to argue over these unanswered questions. It's similar to wondering whether your neighbor got you that pricey gift out of pure charity, or whether they were actually hoping to borrow your lawnmower for the next 10 years. The precise nature of Mycenaean relations with the Hittites about the territory of Hiawa is one of the most important unanswered historical mysteries surrounding Mycenaean diplomacy. Was there a single, cohesive Mycenaean state in Hiawa, or was a confederation of Mycenaean principalities the subject of the reference? And furthermore, to what extent did Mycenaean wax directly influence Mycenaean interests elsewhere, especially in Western Anatolia? The Hittite text's vagueness allows for a wide range of interpretations, which makes this a fertile ground for academic debate. It's similar to wondering whether your neighbor got you that pricey gift out of pure charity, or whether they were actually hoping to borrow your lawnmower for the next 10 years. The precise nature of Mycenaean relations with the Hittites about the territory of Hiawa is one of the most important unanswered historical mysteries surrounding Mycenaean diplomacy. Was there a single, cohesive Mycenaean state in Hiawa, or was a confederation of Mycenaean principalities the subject of the reference? And furthermore, to what extent did Mycenaean wax directly influence Mycenaean interests elsewhere, especially in Western Anatolia? The Hittite text's vagueness allows for a wide range of interpretations, which makes this a fertile ground for academic debate. It's similar to wondering whether your neighbor got you that pricey gift out of pure charity, or whether they were actually hoping to borrow your lawnmower for the next 10 years. The precise nature of Mycenaean relations with the Hittites about the territory of Hiawa is one of the most important unanswered historical mysteries surrounding Mycenaean diplomacy. Was there a single, cohesive Mycenaean state in Hiawa, or was a confederation of Mycenaean principalities the subject of the reference? And furthermore, to what extent did Mycenaean wax directly influence Mycenaean interests elsewhere, especially in Western Anatolia? The Hittite text's vagueness allows for a wide range of interpretations, which makes this a fertile ground for academic debate. It's similar to wondering whether your neighbor got you that pricey gift out of pure charity, or whether they were actually hoping to borrow your lawnmower for the next 10 years. Their growing influence and assimilation into the Late Bronze Age international order were reflected in the dynamic and intricate Mycenaean diplomatic environment. Their interactions with the Egyptians, Hittites, and other nations demonstrate their importance as a regional force that may have an impact well beyond their own borders. Allow your thoughts to evoke visions of far-off courts, presents being exchanged, and the delicate dance of power between ancient monarchs as the night grows more silent. Through their military might and diplomatic skills, the Mycenaeans secured their position at the top of the Bronze Age world social hierarchy, a reflection of their reach and desire. After depicting the Mycenaean world at its height, complete with imposing palaces, a sophisticated economy, a strong military, and a wide-ranging diplomatic network,
we come at one of ancient history's most fascinating and persistent mysteries, the fall of the Bronze Age. Imagine a dynamic, interconnected world system that spans the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, appearing to be at its strongest, abruptly and tragically disintegrating in a short amount of time, approximately between 1200 and 1150 BCE. This was not a slow drop. Almost all of the great civilizations of the time, including the Hittite Empire, the Levantine nations, and of course the Mycenaeans, were impacted by the swift, broad, systemic collapse. It seems as though a terrible, unseen hurricane tore through the whole area,
leaving destruction in its wake. And what in the world happened is the question that historians still struggle with. There is clear-cut archaeological evidence of this collapse. Nearly every grand palatial center on the Mycenaean mainland, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pios, Thebes, Cla, and others, was brutally destroyed, frequently by fire. Ironically, these powerful fires preserved the linear B tablets for humans by baking them. Nevertheless, settlements were abandoned, populations fell, and the advanced palace economy, with its exacting documentation and centralized authority, simply vanished, leaving behind little more than broken crockery, scorched timbers, and mounds of debris. The highly structured society we've been talking about disappeared, to be replaced by a centuries-long so-called Dark Age, marked by more isolated, smaller settlements, a sharp decline in literacy, and a sophisticated material culture. In many respects, it was an unannounced button that reset society. The lack of a widely recognized explanation for the Bronze Age collapse is what makes it such a persistent mystery. Scholars instead suggest a complicated interaction between a number of elements, each of which contributed just slightly to the extensive destruction. It's similar to attempting to solve a particularly challenging murder case, in which the victim appears to have been hit several times and each suspect has a credible motive and alibi. As is frequently the case in history, the truth most likely resides in the way a number of tragedies came together to create a perfect storm of catastrophe. According to one well-known idea, the collapse was caused by outside invasions, specifically by the mysterious tribe known as the Sea Peoples, which we'll discuss in more detail in the following section. According to Egyptian sources, these seaborne pirates were a powerful force that appeared to be spreading throughout the eastern Mediterranean, destroying cities and interfering with trade. One plausible explanation for the palace's violent demise is their possible involvement in the destruction of Mycenaean sites. Imagine how terrifying it would be to have an unidentified, formidable foe arrive by sea and leave nothing but devastation in their wake. According to a different set of ideas, the Mycenaean system carried the seeds for its own demise because of internal causes. Although effective during periods of stability, the highly centralized and inflexible royal economy might have been too fragile to adjust to new difficulties. If the central government failed, overcrowding in some areas may have put a strain on resources, resulting in internal conflict, peasant uprisings, or rivalries between the several palace states. Chaos and starvation would result from the complex redistribution mechanism collapsing. According to this argument, the palaces might have collapsed under their own weight because they were too complex to maintain, much like overly complex machines. It's exploding like the old-fashioned economic bubble, but with much more actual fire and brimstone. Another aspect that is being taken into account more and more is climate change. A period of protracted drought or notable climatic changes around the time of the collapse is suggested by evidence from ice cores, tree rings, and geological surveys. Widespread crop failures, starvation, and migrations brought on by such environmental hardship would have put tremendous burden on already fragile populations. A population that depends on agricultural surplus can easily become unstable due to a series of poor harvests, which would then cause desperate actions and social disintegration.
Imagine the desperation as the once fertile fields turned to dust and the rains failed season after season. Moreover, earthquakes might have been a major, if not the main, factor. Because the Aegean is a seismically active region, significant earthquakes may have frequently weakened fortifications, wrecked infrastructure, and caused widespread unrest. A sequence of significant seismic events might have undoubtedly increased pre-existing vulnerabilities and reduced states' ability to endure other threats, even though an earthquake by itself could not have been sufficient to explain the simultaneous collapse over such a large area. Rebuilding a society or a palace is challenging when the foundation is constantly trembling. Lastly, the collapse hypotheses are also influenced by disturbances to the vital commerce networks. Cutting these supply channels would have seriously damaged the Mycenaean economy, which was largely dependent on the import of essential metals like copper and tin. The supply of these vital raw materials would stop if other Near East powers fell or started widespread piracy, which would leave the Mycenaean military and economy helpless. They were extremely vulnerable to a chain reaction of regional instability because of the interdependence that brought them riches. The demise of the Bronze Age is more than just a destructive riddle. It serves as a powerful reminder of how delicate, sophisticated civilizations may be. It emphasizes how even the strongest cultures can collapse due to the convergence of several seemingly disparate elements. Despite their strength and intellect, the Mycenaeans were not exempt from this age-old reckoning. Let your mind linger on this great historical mystery while the night silence descends around you. The Mycenaean Age's end was more than just a historical occurrence. It was a significant question mark, evidence of the erratic forces that have the power to drastically alter the world in an instant, leaving only hints of what was. One theory stands out and catches people's attention among the many that try to explain the catastrophic fall of the Bronze Age: the mysterious Sea People's involvement. During the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, picture a huge, dark armada traversing the eastern Mediterranean, leaving a path of devastation in their wake. Ancient literature, mostly from Egypt, portray these enigmatic groups as a powerful and unrelenting force that appears to be sweeping away established civilizations and directly contributing to the end of an age. The introduction of such a potent external danger might have been the last straw for the Mycenaeans, who were already dealing with internal pressures and environmental changes. Inscriptions and reliefs on Egyptian temples, especially the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, are our main source of information about the Sea Peoples. In these striking representations, numerous parties of invaders arriving by land and sea engage in violent combat with the Egyptians. These groups are identified in the inscriptions by names such as the Jer, the Danayim, the Shurdan, the Sheshesh, and the Peliset, which are frequently associated with the Philistines in the Bible. Before making an effort to conquer Egypt itself, the writings state that these sea peoples destroyed the Hittite lands, Kakamish, Azawa, Alasya, Cyprus, and Amuru. Although the Egyptian pharaoh takes great pride in having repelled these invaders, it is indisputable that they posed a serious threat and caused extensive damage in other places. The way the Egyptian stories portray the Sea Peoples as a migratory force that moves with their families and belongings in search of new places to reside is very impressive. The scriptures make it clear that the other nations plotted on their islands. The lands were suddenly taken away and dispersed across the conflict. At one point, no land from Hatti, Kode, Kakamish, Arzawa, or Alasya could withstand their arms. In Amuru, a camp was established. They destroyed its inhabitants, and its countryside resembled something that never existed. The flame was ready in front of them as they advanced toward Egypt.
The Peleset, Chequer, Shikes, Denyen, and West United Lands made up their confederation. They touched the ground all the way to the Earth's circumference. This suggests a large-scale, well-coordinated movement, as opposed to isolated pirate operations. The Sea People's belief offers the Mycenaean world a convincing justification for the extensive and terrible destruction of their palaces. Around 1200 BCE, numerous Mycenaean sites exhibit evidence of abrupt, violent fires and collapses that are compatible with external attack. The reasoning is convincing, even though the Sea People's attack on mainland Greece isn't specifically mentioned in the Egyptian scriptures. It is very likely that the wealthy and influential Mycenaean centers would have been the first targets of these gangs if they had been sweeping across the Aegean. Imagine the Mycenaean military, which is extremely well organized but possibly inflexible, up against a desperate, erratic, and mobile adversary that has nothing to lose. Nonetheless, one of the biggest problems in Bronze Age historiography is the exact origin and identity of the Sea Peoples. Were they displaced inhabitants from the Aegean Islands or Anatolia, escaping natural disaster or starvation? Were they groups of mercenaries that betrayed their employers? Were they separate ethnic groups or a confederation of different peoples that were forced to join forces? Certain sea peoples, like the Peleset with the Philistines and the Denian with the Danaan, have been associated by some academics with subsequent historical groups, a term for the Sherdan with Sardinia, or perhaps the Greeks in the Homeric epic. However, there is no concrete archaeological or linguistic evidence to support these ties. Thus, they are still mainly conjectural and hotly contested. It's similar to attempting to piece together a varied pirate crew from a few rumors and one blurry photo. The Sea People's reason is also a mystery, which adds to the intrigue. Were they mostly desperate migrants searching for new homes, or raiders seeking loot? Both are implied by the Egyptian accounts. The fact that they brought their families suggests that they were looking to settle, possibly as a result of natural disasters or population pressures back home, which led to a chain reaction of migration and violence throughout the region. It would have been easy for a string of bad harvests and pre-existing rivalries to tip the scales in favor of mass migration. Whether the Sea Peoples were the only cause of the Mycenaean collapse, or only a contributing factor that took advantage of pre-existing flaws, is a topic of scholarly contention. The majority of contemporary research tends to favor the latter. With its inflexible framework and dependence on long-distance trade, the Mycenaean palace system was already susceptible to internal conflict, resource scarcity, and climate change. Therefore, the Sea People's presence may have been the last straw, a catastrophic outside shock that caused an already precarious system to collapse. It makes the difference between a building collapsing due to internal structural problems and a weak building being overthrown by a strong storm. A later Greek myth of a glorious age ending in disaster, such as the Nostoi, homecomings after the Trojan War, which depicts extensive sorrow and migration, may have been influenced by the memory of such broad damage and population shift. The tragedy of the Bronze Age collapse would have surely persisted in popular memory, influencing subsequent stories as the night becomes darker and ancient mysteries compel reflection, even though it is not a direct historical account. Think about the terrifying picture of the Sea Peoples, a tenacious force whose actual identity is still unknown due to the passage of time, but whose influence on the Mycenaean universe was unquestionably significant. They serve as a potent representation of the tumultuous forces that overthrew a whole era, leaving a quiet that was incredibly loud. Although the mysterious Sea Peoples provide a convincing external explanation for the Mycenaean collapse, a competing and equally convincing body of hypotheses emphasizes internal conflict as a key cause of the Bronze Age's demise.
Imagine a powerful, seemingly stable civilization that appears to be robust on the outside, but is actually rife with structural flaws, resentments, and hidden fissures that, when coupled with other factors, might cause it to violently collapse from inside. Despite its organizational genius, the Mycenaean palace system was susceptible to internal weaknesses because it was a highly centralized and somewhat unstable structure. The essence of the palace economy is a major focus of the internal struggle theory. Although this system was very effective at allocating resources during periods of stability, it also concentrated a great deal of wealth and power in the hands of the Wax and his elite. This might have increased the gap between the governing class and the general public, which might have bred animosity. Consider the farmers and laborers who worked in the fields, creating the excess that fueled the palace, but possibly only getting a small portion in return, particularly when the environment was stressed. It would be extremely difficult for the palace to disperse resources and preserve its legitimacy if crop failures increased in frequency as a result of drought or climate change. The demands of a distant, seemingly heartless king may not be passively accepted by a community facing starvation. Despite their administrative purpose, the Linear B tablets include intriguing signs of internal conflicts. For instance, while there is no concrete evidence of widespread revolt,
Certain Pios tablets discuss the mobilization of coast watchers and the deployment of manpower for defense against both internal and external dangers. It implies a necessity to preserve order within the palace's own grounds, or an awareness of possible disturbance. Furthermore, any internal issues may have been exacerbated by the bureaucratic system's extreme rigidity, which the tablets exposed as being inflexible and reluctant to adjust to quickly changing conditions. As we all know, a complicated bureaucracy may occasionally be its own worst enemy, stumbling over red tape when prompt judgments are required. Interpalatial rivalries are another essential element of the internal struggle hypothesis. Keep in mind that the Mycenaean universe was made up of several strong, independent kingdoms rather than a single, cohesive empire. Among others, Mycenae, Tyrne, Pios, and Thebes. Despite having a similar culture, it is quite likely, even likely, that these states competed for resources, trading routes, and control of the region. A distant recollection of such Bronze Period wars may be reflected in later Greek mythology, which tells of interwoven squabbles among the Achaean heroes, such as the tumultuous relationship between Agamemnon and Achilles, or the ongoing warring among royal houses. The entire Mycenaean structure, training resources, agricultural production, and susceptibility to outside threats may have been compromised if these internal conflicts had intensified. Imagine these powerful citadels turning their strong defenses against one another rather than putting up a united front. A terrible squandering of authority. The Mycenaean warrior elite's success might have also played a role in their demise. A civilization prone to violence and internal power conflicts could have resulted from an ongoing emphasis on military superiority and the exaltation of battle. A vicious cycle of conflict between rival families or factions within and between palaces might have been stoked by the desire for more land, more money, or just greater prestige. This could help to explain why so many palaces exhibit signs of severe fire damage, pointing to potential internal coups or civil conflicts, in addition to foreign attacks. Charred timbers make it difficult to determine if the fire was started by an enemy from outside or by an irate neighbor. The extent to which these internal stressors reached a breaking point before any external pressures actually emerged is a crucial open historical enigma under this notion. Did factions like the Sea Peoples find it easier to target the Mycenaean system when it started to fall apart from within? Or did the outside dangers only highlight and worsen internal flaws that already existed?
It's a classic case of chicken and egg. Did the external shock cause the system to collapse, or was it already failing? Although it's hard to determine a precise order, the susceptibility brought about by internal strife would have undoubtedly exacerbated the consequences of any subsequent catastrophe. Additionally, some academics speculate that a breakdown in the bureaucratic class's efficiency or loyalty may have played a role. The intricate palace economy may come to a complete standstill if the scribes and officials who maintained it were dissatisfied or less capable. The palaces would become less equipped to handle emergencies as a result of this gradual, sneaky deterioration from within, rather than a spectacular revolt. Therefore, as your mind slowly drifts into the serenity of slumber, contemplate the idea that the Mycenaeans, despite their seeming fortitude, were hiding the seeds of their own downfall. They may have been extremely brittle due to the pressures of a strict hierarchy, the possibility of inequality, and the intense rivalries between powerful centers. These internal tensions may have culminated in a catastrophic force that, when combined with other factors, brought their magnificent Bronze Age civilization to an abrupt end. Beyond the drama of invading sea peoples and the gradual burn of internal unrest, it serves as a sobering warning that even the most powerful constructions can collapse when the foundations start to crack from within. The subtle but destructive impact of climatic change is becoming a more convincing explanation for the collapse of the Bronze Age and, consequently, the end of the Mycenaean world. Imagine a society that depends on regular agricultural cycles and is suddenly faced with unpredictable weather patterns, protracted droughts, or a string of poor harvests. Even while they weren't as obvious as an army on the rampage, these environmental stresses could have been a subtle but dangerous factor that weakened the Mycenaean palace economy's foundations over time and made every other vulnerability worse. An increasingly clear picture of major climatic changes around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE is being painted by scientific studies, especially using paleoclimate data from sources including tree rings, ice cores, and sediment samples. There is evidence that the eastern Mediterranean region had a protracted and severe drought at this exact collapse period. This was more than one dry year. A region that is already vulnerable to arid conditions during its long, scorching summers may have been impacted by decades of low rainfall. Imagine the formerly verdant plains becoming arid, rivers reducing to trickles, and crops dying in the relentless sun. An agrarian society like the Mycenaean would have suffered greatly from such a drought. As we have seen, the surplus production of grapes, olives, and cereals served as the foundation for the palatial economy. Widespread famine would have resulted directly from a large and sustained decline in agricultural productivity. It would have overloaded the meticulously controlled redistribution system intended to regulate typical variations. The system that supported the palace would collapse because there would be insufficient food to feed its people, skilled craftspeople, and troops. Imagine the vast grain reserves that were once overflowing, gradually running out and not being refilled by any new harvests. A series of other issues would have been brought on by famine. A hungry population is a desperate one, which can lead to more social disintegration, internal turmoil, and possibly huge migrations as people look for more congenial places to live. Do you recall the theories of internal conflict? Famine brought on by climate change may have been the final straw that triggered those tensions and brought already existing societal injustices to a breaking point. It is an essential idea. The pursuit of the next meal often takes precedence over elaborate political structures when people are famished. Moreover, the Mycenaean commerce networks would have been severely damaged by a drop in agricultural output.
The Mycenaeans would be unable to obtain the essential metals, such as copper and tin, required for the creation of bronze, if they were unable to export enough olive oil or other products. Their ability to manufacture equipment and luxury products, as well as their military might, would have all immediately declined as a result, undermining the palace's economic dominance and status. Since there is no metal to work with and no food to fuel their labor, picture the blacksmiths standing idly with their furnaces cold. Due to the interconnectedness of the late Bronze Age world, a drought in one area may have had far-reaching effects. If, as some evidence suggests, the major Near Eastern powers, such as Egypt and the Hittite Empire, were also experiencing hunger and drought, this would have seriously hampered their ability to trade, offer assistance, or even preserve their own stability. This would have led to the disintegration of the whole complex network of global trade and diplomacy on which the Mycenaeans relied so heavily. The old-fashioned global supply chain would have broken under the strain. The degree to which climate change was the main cause or just a major aggravating element is a crucial academic question in this field. Although it's unclear that climate change was the only factor in the collapse, it most likely increased the Mycenaean world's susceptibility to other stresses. A community already dealing with food shortages and a diminishing resource base would not have been as resilient to the shock of, say, an earthquake or an attack by the sea peoples, whether from internal uprisings or external invasions. It's comparable to someone who has a serious underlying ailment being really sick from a cold. The disease was not caused by the cold. However, it completed the task. A new understanding of the migration of the sea peoples is also provided by the evidence of climate change. If there was widespread drought in several areas, it might have been the catalyst for these populations to leave their native countries and go for other ones, becoming the people on the move that the Egyptians spoke of. They may have become a destructive force as a result of their despair brought on by the collapse of their habitat. This theory suggests a single, potent underlying cause for a wide range of outcomes, deftly connecting numerous pieces of the collapsed jigsaw. Thus, let your mind wander to the silent, unrelenting power of nature as the night grows quieter. Despite their magnificent palaces and powerful armies, the Mycenaeans were ultimately reliant on the delicate equilibrium of their surroundings. In the face of nature's unrelenting will, even the most mighty civilizations are simply fragile constructions, and the gradual, nearly undetectable changes in temperature over decades could have been the final straw. Later Greek tradition developed a compelling story to explain this enormous social change in the wake of the devastating Bronze Age collapse, when the great palaces fell and the advanced Mycenaean culture vanished into obscurity. The myth of the Dorian invasion. Imagine, if you will, a resilient, iron-wielding people coming down from the rocky north, sweeping across the Greek mainland, driving out the Bronze Age residents and bringing in a new era. This tale was widely believed for centuries to be the main historical explanation for the end of the Mycenaean Age and the Greek Dark Ages that followed. But contemporary linguistic and archaeological studies have raised questions about its historical veracity, transforming what was once a fundamental story into a convoluted historiographic controversy. A Greek-speaking people known as the Dorian, who were allegedly different from the Mycenaean Achaeans, moved southward from regions like Macedonia or Epirus, according to the classic account of the Dorian invasion, made popular by ancient Greek historians like Thucydides. They destroyed the Mycenaean centers that were already there and established themselves in their place after conquering the Peloponnese, Crete, and other areas with superior iron weapons, which gave them a technological edge over the Mycenaeans' bronze. This story helped to explain the dispersion of populations during the classical era, as well as the linguistic and cultural distinctions between the many Greek dialects, including Ionic, Aeolic, and Doric. It offered a clear and concise explanation for the abrupt discontinuity between the Bronze and Iron Ages.
Essentially, it was a handy way to blame a turbulent time in history on the new person. Archaeological data appeared to corroborate parts of this theory for a long period. The material culture of these entering Dorian was interpreted as the abrupt emergence of new pottery patterns, such as the sub-Mycenaean and later proto-geometric, as well as distinct burial rituals following the collapse. The idea of a bloody invasion was also supported by the extensive damage of Mycenaean palaces. But as archaeological techniques improved and our knowledge of the Bronze Age collapse expanded, the picture became far more complex, exposing flaws in the conventional wisdom. The decipherment of Linear B presented one of the biggest obstacles to the Dorian invasion theory. As we recall, Linear B turned out to be Mycenaean Greek, an early version of Greek. The notion that the Greek language was brought to the Peloponnese by the invading Dorian is directly refuted by the fact that the Mycenaeans themselves spoke Greek. It was something far more complicated than a cultural or linguistic replacement if the invaders were also Greek speakers. This linguistic consistency pointed to societal unrest or internal migration, as opposed to a total overthrow by a totally foreign element. It's similar to discovering that the intruders were simply your distant cousins who just so happened to bring some new, upscale kitchenware. Additionally, it is dubious to assume that the Dorian had a technological advantage, since they had iron weapons, whilst the Mycenaeans were still in the Bronze Age. The post-colonial era saw the emergence of iron technology, but it was a slow shift rather than an abrupt, overpowering invention brought by invaders. Iron was first challenging to deal with and wasn't always better than bronze, which was still in use. Rather of being the cause of the collapse, the Iron Age really started after it. This lessens the appeal of the invaders brandishing iron. There is growing evidence from contemporary archaeology that the Mycenaean palace destructions were not all at once or uniform. Some places appear to have been abandoned or have seen a more gradual decline, although several exhibit signs of violent ends. A single large-scale invasion by a single Dorian force is less likely as a result of this contradiction. Rather, it suggests a more dispersed and regional sequence of occurrences, maybe influenced by a mix of the previously mentioned elements,
natural calamities, economic downturns, internal turmoil, and perhaps smaller, more focused attacks, possibly even by the Mycenaean populations that were displaced. Whether the Dorian invasion was a more gradual process of internal migration or population change inside the Greek-speaking world, or even an invasion at all, is currently the subject of a significant historiographic controversy. Instead of a major military conquest, Dorian might be referring to a dialect group or a cultural identity that spread through more covert channels, such as the relocation of poor or displaced populations. According to some academics, the idea of Dorians and Ionians only became firmly established after the Dark Ages as a means for later Greeks to comprehend their own varied language and cultural environment. It's similar to proposing a Yorkshire invasion of London to explain regional dialects in the present era. It was probably not as dramatic as it seems. Therefore, it is better to see the Dorian invasion as a founding myth, or a simplified explanation created by later Greeks to make sense of a highly disruptive and poorly remembered era, rather than as a single historical event. It helped to explain the departure from the luxurious Bronze Age past and the formation of their own unique cultural groups. Population movements may have occurred during the turbulent collapse, but they were probably much more intricate and multidimensional than the tidy story of an invading force. As you drift off to sleep, think about how myth continues to influence how we perceive the past. Even the most treasured stories can be re-examined and reinterpreted in light of new evidence, giving us a more complex but ultimately richer understanding of the end of the Mycenaean world.
The Dorian invasion, a story that was once told with such certainty, now serves as a testament to the changing nature of historical inquiry. The Greek mainland entered what historians often refer to as the post-palatial period, or more dramatically, the Greek Dark Ages, in the turbulent aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, when the magnificent Mycenaean palaces lay in ruins and the complex network of their civilization disintegrated. Imagine embers and shadows left behind as a once bright flame sputters and fades. In sharp contrast to the Mycenaean centralized, literary, and globally interconnected culture, this period, which roughly spanned 1200 BCE to 800 BCE, indicates a severe retreat in societal complexity. Significant population declines, knowledge loss, and a reversion to more regional agrarian lifestyles were all part of this period. At first glance, the archaeological evidence for this time is really dismal. Once thriving palace centers have either been abandoned entirely or have substantially decreased populations residing in considerably basic homes. The life inside had mostly disappeared, but the striking cyclopean walls frequently survived. Simpler, less complex, and less widely dispersed material culture, especially pottery, indicates a serious disruption in long-distance trade and skilled craftsmanship. A more austere artistic statement takes the place of the Mycenaean era's colorful frescoes, elaborate seals, and complex metalwork. The Aegeans seem to have been plunged into a time of material poverty and cultural decline, as if the lights had just gone out. The loss of literacy was one of the most significant. When the palaces were destroyed, the linear B script that was so essential to the management of the palace economy disappeared. Greece lost the capacity to read and write for centuries. As a result, we can only understand this era through archaeological investigation because we lack written documents from the whole time period. The reason it is called a Dark Age is because there are no indigenous textual sources, not because everyone had a bad existence, but rather because our historical understanding of it is so bleak. Imagine attempting to comprehend contemporary civilization without the aid of books, emails, or social media, just by looking at its trash heaps and the foundations of dilapidated buildings. The task is intimidating. Additionally, the highly centralized palace economy vanished. The redistributive regime that governed organized labor and enormous resources completely fell apart. Localized barter economies and subsistence cultivation were adopted by communities. The long-distance trade, which was essential for the Mycenaean acquisition of metals like tin, drastically decreased. Due to the lack of essential raw materials, bronze manufacturing was drastically reduced, which resulted in a move toward simpler tools and weapons and the loss of the intricate workmanship that had defined the Bronze Age. The intricate network of global ties that had contributed ideas and income was broken. Another noteworthy aspect of the post-palatial era was depopulation. Archaeological investigations reveal a sharp drop in both the total population and in the number of villages. A number of variables could have contributed to this demographic fall. Environmental shifts, internal strife, war, illness, and migration all contribute to famine. It's possible that a large number of individuals fled to other regions of the Mediterranean or scattered into smaller, more remote rural villages. The once bustling towns and fields would have given way to a much more serene and empty countryside. It's important to emphasize, though, that the term Dark Ages can be deceptive. It wasn't a total nothingness. Local life persisted even as centralized authority vanished. Small, autonomous villages grew up, frequently encircling the remnants of former ones. Perhaps under the guidance of local elders or chieftains, these tribes created new social structures. Instead of the magnificent wax of antiquity, traces of simple metallurgy, first bronze, then iron, pottery manufacture, and agricultural practices demonstrate that skills were not completely forgotten, despite their simplification.
On a far smaller scale, it was a time of reconstruction, reimagining, and adaptability. The degree of cultural continuity or rupture throughout this time is one topic of ongoing historiographic discussion. There were traces of Mycenaean culture that remained after the palace system disappeared. It's a complicated answer. It's possible that some cult rituals persisted in a more basic form. Generations of oral traditions probably retained recollections of the Mycenaean caste, which may have influenced later heroic stories. Even if it is changing, the Greek language's existence itself suggests a deeper cultural continuity. Therefore, even when Mycenaean civilization's advanced accoutrements vanished, its fundamental Greek character persisted, albeit in a broken and altered form. New social structures gradually emerged throughout the post-palatial era, frequently with the oikos family serving as the main social and economic unit. As settlements gradually grew, interacted more, and established increasingly sophisticated systems of government, the earliest manifestations of the Greek polis, city-state, started to take shape towards the end of this period. The economy and warfare of this new era were significantly shaped by the progressive use of iron technology. Let your thoughts linger on the peaceful dusk of the post-palatial era as you fall asleep. The Mycenaean giants' echoes subsided during this time of significant upheaval and difficulty. Nevertheless, the Greek people's tenacious spirit persisted, gradually but steadily creating the foundation for the classical era that would soon come. A monument to the human race's eternal ability to adapt and reconstruct. A new, harsher, and ultimately revolutionary substance gradually but surely started to redefine life across the Greek mainland, even after the most terrible of falls, from the lingering shadows of the post-palatial period. Iron. Imagine a society in which a more plentiful but initially more difficult metal abruptly replaces the valuable, frequently rare alloy of bronze, which is essential for tools and weapons. This change, known as the Iron Age transition, was a significant technological and social transformation that happened gradually throughout the Greek Dark Ages, around 1100 BCE. Establishing a new chapter in Greek history that differs from the centralized Mycenaean past. The reliable supply of copper and tin, which are necessary components of bronze, was severely disrupted during the collapse due to the disintegration of the sophisticated Mycenaean trading networks. All of a sudden, it was much more difficult to get and manufacture bronze in huge amounts. Iron entered the void that this scarcity had created.
The methods for efficiently smelting and forging iron were still in their infancy, despite the fact that iron was well known during the Bronze Age, was challenging to deal with, and was frequently regarded as a valuable, even exotic metal. However, people were compelled to develop and hone their ironworking abilities as a result of the fall of the old order and the urgent necessity for tools and weapons. The switch to iron did not happen overnight. The experiment was a gradual one. When opposed to well-crafted bronze, early iron artifacts were frequently of lower quality. The higher temperatures needed for iron smelting and the processes of carburization, which adds carbon to iron to create steel, and quenching, which creates harder, more resilient tools and weapons, took time for smiths to understand. Bronze continued to be used for a while, often in conjunction with nascent iron technology. Consider it as the awkward adolescent stage of metallurgy, when a new promising but initially awkward alternative was gradually replacing the old dependable substance. It's nearly as if the most popular streaming service abruptly switched to a new, difficult-to-use UI. But iron had one important advantage: its profusion. Iron ore was far more accessible throughout the Greek mainland than copper and tin, which frequently needed to be obtained from far-off sources and depended on intricate trading channels. This accessibility meant communities, even remote ones, may be able to make their own tools and weapons, which would reduce their reliance on centralized authorities, like the old palaces or long-distance trade.
There were significant societal repercussions from this decentralization of metallurgical output. It added to the Dark Ages' disjointed regional character. Iron's influence went much beyond merely weaponry, as local populations became more self-sufficient in basic supplies. Agriculture was transformed by iron implements. Increased agricultural yields could result from iron plowshares breaking through harder soil. Iron axes increased the efficiency of tree cutting and land clearance. Communities would have been able to better utilize their local environment, which would have helped with population expansion and recovery at the end of the Dark Ages. Picture the sound of iron axes slicing through the woods to make way for fresh fields, a sound that represented gradual but effective military advancement. The transition to iron progressively made weapons more accessible to all. Because iron was more widely available, more people could be armed, whereas superior bronze weapons were often reserved for the elite. This could have led to a change in the structure of the military, possibly favoring massed infantry over the Mycenaean elite that drove chariots. However, there is little proof of military infrastructure during the Dark Ages. More general access to efficient instruments for daily activities and defense, however, undoubtedly had a big impact on community power dynamics and daily life. New technologies and artisan skills were also developed as a result of the Iron Age shift. Blacksmiths, who mastered the art of working with this difficult new metal, rose to prominence in their societies. In a world where many Mycenaean crafts had vanished, their skills and knowledge would have been highly prized, representing a new kind of specialized labor. Though on a far smaller scale than the opulent workshops of the past, this change signifies the return of local artisanal production. How exactly iron technology spread throughout Greece and in what cultural context is a major historiographic enigma surrounding this transformation. Was it a unique creation or a variation in several places? Or did it develop and spread from a central location? The precise causes of its increased popularity are still up for question, despite the fact that Anatolia is frequently mentioned as an early hub for ironworks. The precise course of technology transmission is frequently hidden by the gloom of the era itself, making it a complicated puzzle of dissemination and local invention. Back then, the move to the Iron Age involved more than just a change in content. It served as a spark for significant shifts in society. It promoted more local self-sufficiency, eased the transition away from centralized palace systems, and aided in the ultimate economic and demographic rebound that would give rise to the Archaic era and the classical Greek city-states. Mankind learnt to master a new element during this time of material suffering, but it was also a time of great ingenuity and adaptation, literally creating a new future from the rubble of the old. When your thoughts turn to the more profound waves of slumber,
reflect on the timeless meaning of this metallic transition. The change from the glistening, rare bronze of a long-gone empire to the more commonplace yet universally available iron signified not only a conclusion, but also a new beginning, forming the very instruments and routes that would bring classical Greece's splendors to the world after the protracted Greek Dark Ages. The faint echoes of the remote Mycenaean past started to come together into something more concrete, as new towns gradually took root and iron changed day-to-day existence. The Greek myths echoes. Imagine living with the memory of a brilliant but disastrous past in a civilization without written history. How are those epic glories of valiant warriors, bloody conflicts, and powerful monarchs preserved and passed down? They accomplished this through epic poetry, oral tradition, and the very tales that are the foundation of their shared identity. In their epic poems and majestic tales, the later classical Greeks frequently unwittingly tapped upon fractured recollections of the Mycenaean world of the Bronze Age.
The Trojan War is, of course, the most well-known and indisputable connection. Agamemnon of Mycenae leads a vast coalition of Achaean Mycenaean monarchs in their siege of Troy, as depicted in Homer's Iliad, a classic work of Western literature. However, there is still much disagreement among academics regarding whether the Trojan War was historically significant. Was there a single major battle or a collection of minor raids and tales? There is no denying that the Iliad is steeped with Bronze Age cultural milieu. Archaeological discoveries from the Mycenaean era are largely supported by the stories of heroes fighting with bronze armor and weapons, operating chariots, and residing in walled towns ruled by strong monarchs. Fortifications associated with a possible Bronze Age war can even be seen in the plan of Troy as it was excavated. It seems as though Homer, or the tradition from which he drew, created a story around an ancient, rather hazy snapshot of the Mycenaean world. Beyond the Iliad, Mycenaean reality permeates the tales of the great governing houses of Mycenae, such as the line of Nestor at Pios, the house of Atreus at Mycenae, and the house of Lepticus at Thebes. Similar to how Mycenae seems to have been the dominant force in the Argolid, Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, is portrayed as the ultimate warlord. A city that was in fact a major Mycenaean hub is reflected in the tales of Oedipus and the Seven against Thebes. The finding of the extremely well-preserved palace of Nestor coincides with the myth of the wise old king of Pios. Of course, these tales are not historical accounts. These are epic stories that have been adorned and changed throughout centuries of oral tradition. However, they are skewed reflections of a true history that contain shards of reality. Many people believe that the names used in the Homeric epics, including Achaeans, Danon, and Archives, were ancient ones used by the Mycenaean Greeks. Despite Homer's somewhat anachronistic use of chariots and bronze weapons, the Iliadic social structure, with its warrior elite, strong kings, and emphasis on kleos, glory, time, and honor, also bears striking similarities to what we know about Mycenaean society from archaeological evidence and Linear B. The Bronze Age is shown by references to later Greek conflict and descriptions of strong strongholds. But comprehending the intricate connection between myth and history is a major historiographic issue. How much of Homer is a combination of many historical eras or creative invention, and how much is authentic historical recollection? For example, references to iron or certain social customs are among the features in the Iliad that reflect the later Dark Ages, or possibly the early Iron Age. This implies that, despite preserving essential recollections of the Mycenaean past, the oral tradition was dynamic, continuously changing and adding aspects from the period in which it was told. With each recounting, the original message changes, but the essential idea stays the same, making it somewhat like a game of historical telephone. Here, the decline in literacy during the Dark Ages is important.
oral transmission was the only way to retain the memory of the Mycenaean palaces, their exact administrative operations, and their historical events in the absence of written documents. These stories would have been passed down from generation to generation by professional bards like the mythical character of Homer, who would have recounted and modified them. Certain historical facts might have been diluted, obfuscated, or misinterpreted throughout generations as a result of shifting societal norms and novel experiences. The myth's imperfect historical accuracy can be explained by this process. They still have a strong bond with the extinct Bronze Age. The later uncoverings of Mycenaean ruins by archaeologists such as Heinrich Schliemann was surely influenced by the persistent fascination with these heroic narratives. Motivated by his faith in Homer's veracity, Schliemann searched for and discovered the same places described in the epics, bringing the legendary world of Achilles and Agamemnon to life.
Even now, as you enter the deeper stillness of the night, the symbiotic relationship between myth and archaeology is still present, with both illuminating the other while maintaining their separate forms of knowledge. Think about the powerful impact that stories can have. For ages, the Mycenaean world, which was lost to written history, persisted in Greek collective memory through epic tales of gods and heroes. These myths are more than just amusing tales. They are the glistening remains of a vanished society, preserving its memory until the archaeologists' shovels could eventually reveal its firm underpinnings. We now move on to the physical proof that revived the Mycenaeans from the mythical echoes that kept their memory intact, the amazing tale of archaeological finds. Imagine a desolate hill that has long been written off as just a natural creation, only to unexpectedly reveal treasures that alter history and validate the rumors of mythical monarchs from long ago. The excavation of the Mycenaean civilization is an exciting story of tenacity, foresight, and scientific progress that turns enigmatic myths into tangible historical facts. The Mycenaean universe would have mostly remained a domain of domestic poetry, a lovely fantasy rather than a potent actuality, had these laborious excavations not been made. Heinrich Schliemann is without a doubt the story's most important character. Many academics of his era mocked Schliemann, a self-made German businessman who had an almost infantile belief in the epics of Homer being true. However, he started excavations in the late 19th century because he was adamant that Troy, Mycenae, and other epic cities existed. He began excavating Hissarlik in present-day Turkey in 1870 because he was certain it was the location of ancient Troy. To get to what he thought was the Homeric metropolis, he frequently dug straight through layers of history using practices that were uncivilized and harmful by today's standards. However, his findings were unquestionably groundbreaking. He discovered layers of settlement, evidence of devastation, and a walled city that strongly resembled a Bronze-era metropolis. It was a disorganized, frequently troublesome, but unquestionably successful strategy. Sort much like attempting to search through the ashes of a haystack in order to find a needle in it. Schliemann then began studying Mycenae in Greece in 1876. His findings were even more astounding in this regard. The well-known grave circles A and B were discovered by him. At first, he thought he had discovered Agamemnon and his family's royal tombs. However, the wealth discovered, the gold death masks he famously claimed belonged to Agamemnon, the exquisite bronze weapons inlaid with silver and gold, and the elaborate jewelry proved that a wealthy and powerful Bronze Age civilization had indeed existed on the Greek mainland. The prevalent scholarly belief that the Homeric descriptions were merely fiction was disproved by the splendor of these discoveries. After being buried for ages, the Aegeans suddenly experienced a corporal world, their glittering gold nearly blinding in the glaring Attic sun. Schliemann's innovative, albeit somewhat unscientific, pioneering work paved the way for more methodical and rigorous approaches from later archaeologists.
The key to comprehending Mycenaean growth was the spectacular Minoan civilization, which was discovered by British archaeologist Arthur Evans when he first started excavating at Knossos in 1900. His research established the cultural and historical connections between the two major Bronze Age kingdoms and demonstrated the significant impact of Minoan culture on the mainland. Archaeologists like Carl Blegen of the University of Cincinnati made equally important contributions back on the mainland. The extraordinarily well-preserved palace of Nestor and, most importantly, thousands of Linear B tablets were found during his painstaking excavations at Pylos in the 1930s and 1950s. The Pylos tablets were unquestionably Mycenaean due to their superb preservation, in contrast to the Knossos tablets, which were in a different script, Linear A, which was subsequently determined to be Minoan.
Ironically, the palace's destruction by fire offered a hitherto unheard-of literary window into the day-to-day operations, financial system, and social structure of a Mycenaean monarchy. As we recall, Michael Ventress's decipherment of Linear B, a veritable triumph of linguistic genius and archaeological data, was made possible in large part by this discovery. Archaeological research keeps expanding our knowledge. Regional differences, large fortifications, workshops, and further textual evidence have been discovered through the methodical exploration of sites such as Tenes, Thebes, Okamenos, and many smaller communities. The discovery of shipwrecks loaded with Bronze Age goods has also been a significant contribution from underwater archaeology, offering concrete proof of Mycenaean trade networks throughout the Mediterranean. Their extensive oceanic reach is directly demonstrated by these submerged time capsules. Organic elements that are rarely found on land, such as wooden ship components, can occasionally be preserved. Interpreting some archaeological artifacts in light of later classical traditions or even the Linear B texts is one persistent historiographic conundrum. Chariots, for instance, are clearly present in Linear B, but their exact tactical placement in real Mycenaean combat is still up for question based on the topography and artistic representations. Similarly, there is room for scholarly debate over the precise nature of cultic places and the interpretation of ritual artifacts, both of which frequently rely on inference. The what is provided by the material record, but the why and how are occasionally obscure, allowing for further discussion and the development of new theories. Mycenaean archaeology's story is far from over. New technologies are continuously providing new insights and bringing to light previously unnoticed facts. Examples of these technologies include DNA analysis of ancient remains, ground-penetrating radar, and remote sensing. The intricate puzzle of this powerful society is completed with each new pottery fragment, wall discovered, and sign read. It serves as a reminder that history is dynamic. It is a dynamic story that is continually being rewritten by fresh findings. Imagine the excitement of discovery, the moment when dusty dirt gave way to sparkling gold, or the moment when a crumbling clay tablet suddenly uttered a forgotten language as you drift towards the calm of deep sleep. Ancient towns have not been the only discoveries made by these archaeological projects. We may now immediately touch with the very roots of Greek history, since they have brought an entire civilization back to life. The perseverance of those who ventured to dig allowed for this voyage through time. It's crucial to recognize that, despite enormous findings, there are still a lot of unsolved problems regarding this ancient society as we draw to a close our exploration of the Mycenaean world, having examined both its magnificence and its terrible downfall. Imagine seeing into the past through a poorly lit window. Although a lot is visible, important elements are obscured, which sparks incessant interest and academic discussion. These persistent enigmas are more than just information gaps. They serve as calls for more study, innovative archaeological techniques, and novel interpretations, serving as a reminder that history is a dynamic area of continuous investigation rather than a definitive account. The exact origins and mechanisms of the collapse of the Bronze Age itself are among the most deep and enduring mysteries.
The precise interaction and relative importance of these factors are still up for debate, despite the fact that we have covered a number of theories: sea peoples, internal conflict, climate change, and earthquakes. Did a complex system collapse due to the convergence of several stressors, or was there a single dominant cause? For instance, did starvation, brought on by the environment, weaken the palaces and encourage internal rebellion, leaving them open to external raids by desperate populations like the sea peoples? The archaeological record, which often only offers proof of destruction and not the specific events leading up to it, makes it extremely difficult to decipher the precise chronology and causal linkages.
It's similar to trying to recreate every exact moment of a complex accident after you get there. The identities and origins of the sea peoples are another important mystery. Thanks to Egyptian records, we are aware of their existence and the significant disturbance they created. However, from what location did they originate? Were they a loose confederation of several peoples uprooted by their own catastrophe? Or were they a single ethnic group? And after their turbulent Mediterranean sweep, where did they go? It is still difficult to find conclusive archaeological or linguistic proof of their precise homelands or final destinations, despite some connections to succeeding cultures such as the Philistines being believable. They are little more than the mysterious specters of the late Bronze Age who have left a path of devastation in their wake. There are also persistent questions about the Mycenaean world's political structure. Did the entire Mycenaean Empire have a centralized capital at Mycenae? Or was it a more loose association of autonomous city-states or aristocratic hubs that had a similar culture and might have forged alliances when necessary? Although the Linear B tablets contain extensive administrative details, they don't provide much direct insight into the political connections across palaces. Did they maintain a more stable balance of power by diplomacy and intermarriage, or were they always at war, as the Homeric epic occasionally suggests? Because the data is frequently unclear, different experts will interpret it differently. Ancient ruins make it difficult to determine whether two palaces were neighbors who didn't exchange Christmas greetings or bitter enemies. Moreover, there are still a lot of mysteries surrounding the Mycenaean faith. The deeper theological beliefs, the particular narratives linked with their gods, and the precise rituals performed are still mostly unknown, even if we can identify some deities with later Greek gods from Linear B and identify some cultic practices from archaeological remnants. Did complex priesthoods exist? What were the botany figures like? How did their religious beliefs influence their decisions and day-to-day activities beyond simple sacrifices? We are left with intriguing shards due to the dearth of narrative religious texts, which forces researchers to make assumptions based on scant data. Another topic of continuous discussion is the character of Mycenaean international endeavors outside of trade. The degree and type of Mycenaean military activity in Anatolia are uncertain, despite the Hittite writings' suggestion of such involvement, the Ayahiwa connection. Did they set up military garrisons, colonies, or trading posts abroad? It is unclear if the high archaeological presence of Mycenaean ceramics overseas is due to extensive trade or active political and military expansion. It's similar to attempting to determine whether a foreign nation has taken over your town after seeing a lot of foreign goods in your neighborhood grocery. Lastly, concerns regarding cultural continuity are raised by the shift from the highly developed Mycenaean civilization to the ostensibly destitute Dark Ages. How much Mycenaean expertise was actually lost, especially in fields like engineering, long-distance navigation, and administrative procedures, and the extent to which it persisted in fractured form, possibly through oral or regional customs. For instance, there are structural parallels between Linear B and the development of the Greek alphabet centuries later, indicating some underlying memory or influence, even if it was indirect. The fact that aspects of the past were able to gently influence the future, even after such a devastating breach, is evidence of how resilient culture is. These unresolved issues demonstrate the richness and complexity of the Mycenaean past, rather than indicating failure, with each new finding having the potential to solve a conundrum or amusingly raising a whole new set of questions as the last edges of alertness fade.
They make sure that the field of Mycenaean research stays lively and fascinating. Allow these timeless enigmas to slowly become ingrained in your thoughts.
They are the captivating echoes of a vanished society, beckoning us to continue hearing, exploring, and reflecting on the depths of human history. As our extensive voyage through the history of the Mycenaean civilization comes to an end, it serves as a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, still contains secrets that have not yet been discovered. From their gloomy origins to their dazzling peak and abrupt, unexplained death, we arrive at their significant and indisputable legacy and impact. Imagine a powerful river that, even though it sometimes stops flowing, leaves behind rich deposits that support new growth. Or a great melody that, although fading, serves as the inspiration for brand new songs. Even though the Mycenaeans were no longer a separate political and economic force, they left a huge cultural and historical mark on later Greek culture, influencing everything from mythology and language to art and social systems for thousands of years. The Greek language itself may be the most obvious legacy. The Mycenaeans' language was an early variant of the language that would eventually develop into Classical Greek, as demonstrated by the decipherment of Linear B as Mycenaean Greek, the language of Sophocles, Plato, and Homer. Mycenaean Greek is the oldest known version of the language, establishing a direct, uninterrupted linguistic ancestry that dates back to the Bronze Age. Because of this relationship, reading Homer is like hearing the distant echoes of Mycenaean BS and their oral traditions, a live link between the supposedly dark centuries. Naturally, the language changed, but its essential elements continued to be a reflection of persistent cultural identity. Another enduring legacy is the epic poetry and heroic mythology, especially the Homeric epics. As we have seen in the stories of the Trojan War, the Mycenaean history is strongly ingrained in the myths of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus, as well as the strong dynasties of Mycenae, robbers, and Boss. These tales, though adorned and altered throughout centuries of oral tradition, preserved a shared recollection of a magnificent bronze-clad era of strong monarchs and epic battles. They developed into the fundamental stories of classical Greek identity, influencing their perception of their own history, their sense of honor and bravery, and even their knowledge of geography. Without these tales, ancient Greece would be difficult to imagine, and without their Mycenaean ancestry, they would also be unthinkable. Although the classical era produced its own unique styles in art and architecture, Mycenaean influence can be faintly seen. The Cyclopean walls reverberate with the very idea of colossal stone construction, especially for defensive purposes. With a central hearth and a similar axial form, the Megaron, the main hall of the Mycenaean palace, is frequently regarded as an antecedent of later Greek temple architecture, albeit one used for religious rather than royal purposes. It's possible that some creative conventions or ornamental motifs were quietly transmitted, influencing nascent artistic manifestations during the Iron Age.
My graduation artwork's striking, potent imagery, which was centered on narrative and might, is a prehistoric example of Greek artistic inventiveness in both social and political contexts. Some of the basic foundations for later Greek advances were established during the Mycenaean period. The separate palace centers of the Mycenaean era may have served as the inspiration for the concept of the autonomous but culturally connected city-state polis that would rule classical Greece. The idea of a centralized authority ruling a surrounding realm, however fragmented, served as an early model, even if the Mycenaean Wenax was a far more despotic character than later Greek magistrates. The idea of a hierarchical society, complete with governing classes and skilled artisans, established a framework that would be rethought and reorganized in the new city-states. The marine tradition that would characterize later Greek colonization and growth was also nurtured during the Mycenaean period. Their vast networks of trade throughout the Mediterranean showed how strategically important sailing and cross-cultural interaction were. The Greeks would eventually perfect these talents to become seafaring masters and build colonies all over the world. They demonstrated the importance of maritime corridors for influence and trade. Their successors learned a valuable lesson. Last but not least, the trauma of the fall of the Bronze Age and the ensuing Dark Ages left a lasting impression.
The Greek people probably developed a deep-seated resilience and adaptability as a result of this experience of societal breakdown and recovery. When old systems failed, it taught them to rebuild, to innovate like iron, and to develop new ways to organize themselves. Ironically, the end of the Mycenaean world precipitated this challenging time of change, which ultimately added to ancient Greece's distinctive vitality and inventiveness. To put it simply, the Mycenaeans were more than a forerunner. They provided a strong basis. The complex fabric of classical Greek civilization was woven together by their language, heroes, remarkable material culture, and even the disaster that brought their era to an end. Based on extensive archaeological and linguistic evidence, they were the first Greeks to be identified, the first to construct the magnificent buildings, speak the language, and fight the epic battles that would serve as an inspiration to generations to come. Their tale serves as a reminder that even when great civilizations collapse, their effects are seen and continue to influence the future in both little and significant ways.